Story 1.
You surely know that 70% of Earth's surface is covered by water and 97% of it is salty. Can you imagine what might be hiding in the depths of these vast territories? Even discovering one new island reveals many species and teaches us something new. So what can be said about the vast expanses of the ocean floor? What might be hiding there? My name is Everett, and I work on an oil rig in the North Sea, not far from the coast of England, at a depth of about 3,000 meters. We are engaged in oil and gas extraction. This work is complex and requires maximum care because any mistake can lead to a catastrophe. I am the operations dispatcher responsible for controlling the extraction process, technical maintenance, and personnel training. My workspace is a room with multiple screens displaying all parts of the station and the seabed, where the blowout preventer is installed. This device prevents high-pressure blowouts. If it fails, oil under high pressure can erupt. I also oversee the work of personnel and various aspects of the drilling platform's operations. About 200 people work here, including drillers, technical, and maintenance staff. The work here is continuous. We work 12-hour shifts. Every 3 weeks we return to shore, usually by boats. But in bad weather, a helicopter is sent for us. The North Sea is famous for its strong storms, which can pose a serious danger due to high wind speeds and large waves. Our floating platform is held on the surface by 2 underwater pontoons, ensuring its stability, and anchored by 4 cables stretching to the seabed, ensuring its reliable retention. The work here is very demanding, but the pay is significantly higher than on land. The main requirement is maximum concentration because any mistakes can lead to fires, explosions, or mechanical injuries. Once, when I had just started working, my experienced senior colleague overlooked the pressure in the compression hose, which burst and hit him with force. He was thrown by the impact and died on the spot. Yes, accidents happen here, so safety precautions are strictly enforced. On that day, I had just returned to the station after a 3-week shift. After taking my post, I began monitoring the cameras and noticed strange behavior from Bob, a technical employee who was in the drilling compartment and standing still. I called out to him on the radio. "Hey Bob, buddy, what's up with you?" But he didn't respond. I tried calling him again, but there was no response. So I contacted Bill, who was working nearby, and asked him to check on his colleague. On the screen, I saw Bill approach him and start shaking him. Bob seemed to be in a trance, and only after Bill shook him harder did he snap out of it and look around, not understanding what was happening. Then I called for another worker to replace him and a doctor, then asked an assistant to watch over the station and went to the medical block. It was important for me to know the employee's condition as it could seriously affect the work. When I arrived, I saw 2 doctors leaning over the patient. One was shining a flashlight in his eyes to check his reaction, while the other was examining his chart. I asked what was going on, but only saw signs of confusion on their faces. So I turned to Bob. "I don't know myself," he replied. "When I was working, I heard a banging noise. I immediately got worried and started looking for the cause, but it seemed like the noise was coming from outside. I listened, and suddenly the sound started getting closer to me, as if something was rising from the depths. It was getting closer and closer, and it seemed like the surrounding reality was dissolving. When it seemed like it was almost reaching me, I suddenly woke up. Honestly, it scared me. It was like some kind of primal fear. I wanted to run but couldn't move, as if something had caught me like a spider in its web." Listening to his story, I couldn't believe his words. Nodding as if understanding him, I patted him on the shoulder, then called the head doctor and asked to check Bob for drugs. It was also worth considering the possibility of a mental disorder. Overall, the situation looked strange. Fortunately, we had a replacement worker, but I still needed to report what was happening to the base. Saying goodbye, I asked Bob to stay in the infirmary for observation and expressed hope that he would be fine tomorrow. Then I returned to the observation room and contacted the shore base. From there, I was advised to wait, and they said they would send a replacement if necessary. When my shift ended, I headed to the drilling compartment and asked the workers if they had heard any suspicious banging, but they just shook their heads. Then I inspected the place where Bob had worked and listened carefully, but heard nothing. After all, it was related to Bob himself, I concluded, and went on vacation. The next day, there was a calm at sea, a rarity for this area. Stepping out onto the platform, I looked around. A fog was slowly thickening, becoming denser with each passing minute. This caused me concern because in all my time working here, I had never encountered anything like it. Other workers also came out to see what was happening, looking around in surprise and whispering to each other. Such a phenomenon would be more typical for a small lake, not the turbulent North Sea. After standing for some time, I ordered everyone to disperse and get to work. The morning passed without incident. During lunch, I planned to check on Bob's condition. Just as I was about to get up, my assistant Henry noticed something strange on the underwater camera. It was camera number 23, installed on the blowout preventer and aimed at the seabed around it. Henry pointed to an area of the seabed where it seemed like something was hitting the bottom, causing bits of earth and rocks to float up, along with bubbles. "What is this?" I asked in surprise. Could it be a blowout? But the sensors showed that the pressure was normal and hadn't changed even slightly. Then what is it? Maybe some kind of fish? But the hits were rhythmic, as if someone was playing drums. I watched this strange phenomenon for a while, then headed to the infirmary to check on Bob. Arriving there, I saw doctors bustling around someone. Soon I saw the patient lying on the bed, clutching his ears and screaming loudly. The doctors tried to calm him down, but he didn't respond and continued to thrash and scream. I rushed to help the doctors and held Bob's shoulder while one of the doctors administered a sedative. After some time, Bob fell asleep. We gently laid him on the bed and covered him with a blanket. Then I asked the doctors what had happened. They explained that everything was normal until lunch. He had gotten up early and said he was feeling fine. However, then his face suddenly took on a frightened look. Apparently, he heard the banging again. He jumped up and began pacing around the infirmary, listening to something. Suddenly, he screamed and grabbed his ears. We asked him to describe the pain, but he didn't respond. The situation was escalating, so I contacted the base, explained what had happened, and asked them to send a helicopter. Bob needed to be taken ashore as soon as possible. However, I was refused, as they said that due to the dense fog in the platform area, movement was impossible. That fog again, I thought. All right, nothing to be done, we'll have to wait. Gathering my thoughts, I returned to work. Henry continued to monitor camera number 23. I approached him and reminded him not to forget to monitor the entire station. He seemed to snap out of it, scratched his head, and apologized. My shift was coming to an end, and all this time I couldn't stop thinking about this phenomenon. This mystery wouldn't leave my mind. By the end of the shift, Henry was again glued to screen 23. We noticed that a rectangular trench had formed on the seabed, as if something had been buried there and it was trying to break free. We recorded this phenomenon and sent the recording to the base for analysis. The next morning, I went out to the observation deck early. The sea was calm and the fog seemed even thicker. Coming to the observation post, I saw that Henry was already there. 3 men were staring at the monitor. I immediately understood that it was camera 23. Looking at the screen, I noticed a rectangular pit on the seabed. Whatever it was, it had surfaced. I started asking my colleagues if they had seen what it was, but they shook their heads. So I sat down at my desk and started looking for the folder with the recordings. Finding the right file, I pressed the play button and started looking for the right moment. After a while, Henry exclaimed, "There it is, rewind." I did, and saw how a coffin with beautiful carvings and patterns suddenly burst out of the ground with the last blow. It floated to the surface. We watched this scene in shock. Henry, being a very religious person, began to recite prayers. I also searched for an explanation in my mind. However, pulling myself together, I thought that since the object had surfaced, there was no need to worry about it. Closing the recording, I got back to work. But the calm didn't last long. I noticed on one of the cameras that the doctors were running around the platform in a frenzy. I had to go out and find out what was happening. On the way, I met one of the doctors who, breathing heavily, told me that Bob was missing. Tension reached its peak when we called in additional forces to search. I radioed Henry and asked him to check the surveillance footage. After half an hour of searching, we found no traces, but then I heard Henry's worried voice over the radio, urgently inviting me to the observation point. Arriving there, I found that the station chief, Mr. Blackwood, was already there. They were carefully studying the camera recordings. On the screen, the infirmary appeared first, where Bob lay on the bed. Suddenly, he sat up sharply, shocking me so much that I took a step back. Then Bob got up and quickly headed for the exit. The camera switched, and we saw him walking down the corridor and out onto the street. The next image showed the outside of the platform, where Bob suddenly ran and jumped into the sea. I wanted to shout at him to stop, realizing that it was already too late. This action evoked a wave of emotions in me. We stood, digesting what we saw, until Mr. Blackwood ordered a lifeboat to be lowered and the search for the body to begin, although the chances of finding him were slim. Surviving in these icy waters was almost impossible. As expected, the search yielded no results. Rumors began to circulate around the station. As I passed by the dining room, I saw everyone whispering and discussing the situation. And I didn't blame them. In the last few days, indeed, a lot of strange things had happened. I couldn't sleep at night, and when I finally managed to fall asleep, I saw something terrifying. I walked through the station, which was surprisingly empty. There were no people here. I walked, inspecting the rooms and calling out to someone, but no one responded. Then I went up to the main platform, where we often held meetings. There I saw a man standing on the edge of the platform, looking at the sea. The wind played with his hair, and his posture exuded some kind of majesty. He was dressed in strange clothes, reminiscent of the attire of Romans that I had seen in movies and books. As I approached, he turned around. I noticed a golden crown on his head, encrusted with diamonds in the shape of a star. His face was pleasant, I would even say beautiful. A straight pointed nose, high cheekbones, eyes of a dark red color. Wait. Why did he have red eyes? I thought to myself. But before I could reflect on it, he raised his hand, pointing at something behind me. When I turned around, I froze in shock. There were bodies scattered all over the platform. They were all dressed in our company's uniforms, but it was hard to tell who was who, as they all seemed shriveled. Here I saw a tag with Bob's name on one of the forms. From his empty eye socket crawled a disgusting creature resembling a centipede, but it had a head with a large round mouth filled with small sharp teeth. Suddenly it began crawling towards me. I was frightened and started backing away, and it accelerated too. Then I turned around and tried to run, but saw that a horrifying creature stood in place of the man. He was dressed in the same attire, but his face resembled that of a terrifying demon with dark red skin, sharp fangs, a flat nose, and pointed ears. Behind him were bat-like wings. Suddenly he bared his teeth and spread his wings, flying towards me. I was horrified and ran to the left. Looking back, I realized that these creatures were following me. I ran with all my might, but it seemed they were about to catch up. But suddenly, ahead I saw an old man standing at the door, also dressed in ancient clothing. Could he also be a monster? But he waved his hand, inviting me to come inside. I didn't have much of a choice, so I followed him. He locked the door and there was a loud knock. Then another one. I feared they would break down the door, but the old man remained calm. He headed into the dark corridor, as if asking me to follow, but I hesitated. I looked back and saw the trembling door. The creature was fiercely trying to break through. I had to follow the old man, I thought, but when I turned around, he was gone. I heard the loud knock again, like the clang of metal against metal, and I woke up. I lay in bed, trying to regain my senses, wondering about that strange dream. Someone persistently knocked on the door of the room. I got up and opened it, seeing Henry with a concerned expression. Before I could ask what was happening, I heard a loud ringing, the same one from my dream. What was that? I looked at my colleague in surprise. He just shrugged. I got dressed, and we went outside. Many people had gathered, awakened by the noise. Everyone looked around fearfully, trying to find the source of the sound. It was beginning to dawn, but the dense fog obscured the view. Suddenly, someone shouted that the noise was coming from below the platform where the pillars stood. We craned our necks and saw something dark beating against one of the pillars. But what was strange was that the sea was calm, with no waves, yet this thing beat rhythmically. Soon the boss came out and ordered a lifeboat to be lowered. I volunteered to help. When we got to the sea, we immediately headed towards the thing. As we approached, I realized what it was. How did I not figure it out immediately? Floating on the water was that same iron coffin, chained up. Waves were hitting it against the pillar. It was a strange sight. We looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Contacting via radio, we reported the situation. Mr. Blackwood then ordered the coffin to be brought up. I was against it, feeling a bad vibe, but I didn't argue. Soon ropes were lowered, and we secured the coffin before lifting it up. When we returned, some of the workers began sawing the chains. I wanted to stop them, but didn't know what argument to use. If I said I had a bad feeling, this group of workers and engineers would look at me like I was crazy. Although I noticed that some people, those who were particularly superstitious, weren't too happy about what was happening. The boss stood by the coffin, ordering this or that chain to be cut, as if he were on a production line. Soon the last link was cut, and the chains fell to the ground with a clang. When this happened, I felt a slight wave. Was it just me? I looked around, but the faces of those around me seemed unchanged. We surrounded the coffin, examining the carvings and inscriptions on it. The boss searched for a tool to help open it. Finally finding it, he cleaned it of rust and pulled. My heart was racing. What awaited us inside? It didn't budge at first, so a few more people joined in, and the coffin lid opened. I expected some kind of monster to jump out, but it was empty inside. What? Everyone looked puzzled at the empty coffin, hoping to see at least a corpse or some treasure. But it was empty. Mr. Blackwood ordered it to be taken to the hangar, as it might be of interest to archaeologists and historians. The workers discussed what had happened and began to disperse. I blamed myself for being cowardly and overly cautious. then returned to my room. The day passed without incident. The base was informed of Bob's death and the discovery. The helicopter still couldn't fly due to the fog. This whole situation made me feel isolated. I decided to distract myself and not dwell on the bad, but the dream I had kept resurfacing in my mind. As the shift neared its end, I noticed something had happened on one of the cameras. It was the storage room. Contacting via radio, I asked what was going on. I was told that a body had been found there. Someone else died. I rushed over, and when I arrived, I saw a crowd of people. Familiar doctors were bent over something resembling a human. When I got closer, I saw a body lying on the floor, leaning against the wall. But the most horrifying thing that made my hair stand on end was that the body was dried up, as if all the water had been drained from it. Just like I saw in my dream. I felt a weakness and horror that made it hard for me to move. The people around me also had frightened faces. Soon the boss arrived and questioned the sole witness. The incident occurred in a dead zone, so there were no camera recordings. It turned out that the deceased's name was Jack. He had been sent to the warehouse to fetch welding equipment, but he hadn't returned. The witness went to look for him and found his body there. He didn't see anything suspicious. The situation worsened, and we contacted the base, where they also became concerned. They said they would send a helicopter with the necessary personnel tomorrow regardless of the fog. But that was not to be. The calm sea was replaced by a raging storm. All the workers hid in the inner compartments, afraid of being swept into the sea. I spent the whole day pondering my dream and the discovered body. Could my dream be true? What should I do? Because of the storm, we were trapped. My thoughts again turned to the coffin. I talked about it with Henry, telling him everything without hiding. At first, he didn't believe me, but as I recounted the story, his face began to show fear. After discussing everything, we decided to get rid of the coffin, just in case. Henry and I decided to act immediately after our shift despite the raging storm outside. Wearing the necessary storm-resistant suits, we stepped out of the relative safety of the indoor areas into the raging storm. Making our way to the hangar where the coffin was stored, every step was difficult. The wind blew so forcefully in our faces that it felt like we were walking against an invisible wall. Rain pelted our suits like thousands of needles, making every movement painful. Huge waves crashed against the platform, creating a menacing roar that drowned out our attempts to speak to each other. We had to shout to be heard even at arm's length. Reaching the hangar, we found the coffin where we had left it. It seemed even more ominous against the backdrop of the raging storm. Lifting it, we began clumsily making our way back to the edge of the platform. Every gust of wind made us stumble and lose our balance, and the waves crashing against the platform seemed eager to take it back into the sea. Reaching the edge, Henry and I tried to lift the coffin to throw it into the ocean, but the storm refused to abate, and each attempt was unsuccessful. The wind and water seemed to conspire against us, pushing it back onto the platform. We were on the verge of physical and emotional exhaustion, trying to hold on to the coffin, which in this storm seemed not just heavy but alive, as if something inside resisted its return to the sea. With each passing minute, the storm seemed more powerful, and Henry and I, summoning all our strength, made one final, determined attempt. With our combined efforts, using all our strength and willpower, we finally managed to move the coffin and throw it into the raging sea. Looking down, we saw dark waves swallow it up. Having done our deed, we headed back to the residential quarters. Upon arriving there, wet and exhausted but satisfied with our work, we returned to our rooms Was it finally over? But the storm outside continued to rage, and when it would end was unknown. At night, I dreamt fragments again. I briefly saw the old man who saved me. It seemed like he was trying to catch the right wave on the radio to reach me, but he couldn't. When I woke up, I felt shattered. After washing up, I headed to the mess hall. The storm was still raging outside. When I arrived, I saw that there was no one there. Where was everyone? I thought. Soon I saw someone running down the corridor. I called out to him, and he stopped with a frightened face, telling me that more deaths had occurred. I was surprised and ran with him. This time it happened in one of the residential rooms. 4 people were sleeping there, and they were all dead. The deaths occurred in the same way as before, with all their fluids drained, leaving only corpses. 2 doctors were examining the bodies, and one of them found a mark on the neck of one of the deceased. In the shape of a large circle, I remembered the creature from my dream. Could all this be true? The atmosphere on the platform became tense. No one was safe. As I stood examining the bodies, my radio turned on and Henry urgently told me to return as unforeseen circumstances had arisen. Without hesitation, I headed back there. When I arrived at the observation and communication post, I saw that everyone had tense faces. Henry told me that we had lost contact with the mainland. We were left here alone. A trap closed with a bang in my mind. What should we do? Leave the platform. We can't do that because special procedures and equipment are needed to shut down the well for conservation purposes. And right now it's running non-stop. If there's a leak, tons of oil will spill into the sea, causing an environmental disaster. On the other hand, some entity has settled here and is killing us one by one. No one knows what it is, but I'm increasingly convinced that my dream wasn't just imagination. As we stood discussing what to do, we suddenly heard a ringing, the same one we heard earlier. Everyone looked at each other in surprise. Mr. Blackwood asked if the coffin wasn't stored in the hangar, so I told him what had happened, how we threw it into the sea. But why? The boss asked, astonished. And I had to tell them everything. Everyone had shocked faces mixed with disbelief. I realized they didn't believe me. I wouldn't believe myself either. But what was happening here spoke otherwise. Mr. Blackwood came up to me and, putting his hand on my shoulder, told me to relax. Apparently recent events had taken a toll on me. I tried to object, pointing to the bodies and Bob, but he said there was a scientific explanation for everything. I gave up. Apparently they wouldn't believe it until they saw it with their own eyes. After that, I headed to my quarters. As I walked, the ringing continued. Because of the storm, we couldn't do anything. Going down now was akin to suicide. I lay down on the bed. The ringing prevented me from sleeping. It seemed like someone was banging a gong right next to my ear. But soon somehow I managed to fall asleep. I found myself in a room where the familiar old man sat. He was writing something, and when I wanted to ask him where I was, he put aside his notes, stood up, looked me in the eyes, then silently headed for the exit, indicating that I should follow him. We went outside, which resembled ancient Rome, but instead of crowded streets, there were corpses everywhere. They were all dried up. The old man headed to the right, and I followed, constantly looking around. What happened here, and where are we? Along the way, I saw rich architecture and beautiful statues. I became more convinced that I was in ancient Rome. The further we went, the more corpses we encountered. There was also more blood. It seemed the creature had been satiated and started killing just for fun. Soon we reached a slope with stairs. The old man started climbing up. It was high, and when we finally reached the top, I saw a huge throne where the man-monster from my dream was sitting. Around him were a huge number of corpses infested with thousands of those centipedes. It was such a disgusting scene that I almost vomited. It seemed this man was reveling in all this spectacle when suddenly an army of people started climbing the stairs behind me. Among them I noticed not only courageous heroes, but also old men and children, as well as women dressed in protective Roman armor. It seemed the entire human race had come out for the final battle. They stood facing the throne, looking at each other as if they were the deadliest enemies. Then a man emerged from the crowd. I recognized him. It was the same old man who brought me here, only younger. He raised his sword and, shouting something, rushed at the monster. His example was followed by others, shouting something, flags waving everywhere, the sound of thousands of feet stomping. But soon the slaughter began. Thousands of centipedes attacked the people, who in turn lit torches, setting them on fire. Soon the monster itself joined the battle, leaping off the throne, spreading its wings, and taking off before diving down, killing one after another. It seemed like all was lost, but when I looked back, I saw hundreds of thousands more people climbing the stairs. It was indeed the final battle. People were dying, forming a huge pile. The centipedes were dwindling, but this vampire king seemed tireless. Sometimes, swooping down, he would grab a person and take off, then suck their blood before continuing the fight. There were still many people, but defeat seemed inevitable. Looking at the stairs, I saw that they were passing some heavy pitchers along a chain, filled with something and tightly sealed. I watched them, wondering what it was. When the pitchers reached the top, they began throwing them at the monster. They shattered, enveloping everything in black. It was oil. They continued to throw it. The creature had no idea what they were doing. They had previously extinguished all the torches and were waiting for something. More and more oil reached the top. They stopped throwing the pitchers and began piling them up into a mound. Then, when they were done, they started luring the creature toward it, and it took the bait. When the vampire flew into the crowd, a young man with a lit torch suddenly emerged from somewhere. Everything happened so fast. Then there was a huge explosion, and then a fire. I didn't feel the heat, but I saw everything around me starting to melt. Hundreds of people died on the spot. But the creature also suffered. Charred with limbs torn off, it lay on the ground. Then the surviving people rushed up and began stabbing it with pikes and slashing it with swords. But it still kept moving. Then the crowd parted, and they brought the familiar coffin to the top. Putting the creature inside, they chained the coffin and dragged it toward the sea. Suddenly, the vision dispersed, and we found ourselves again in the same room where I appeared at the beginning. The old man was sitting with his back to me, writing something. I asked him what it was, but he turned to me silently, smiled, and struck the gong lying on his table. After that, I woke up. Lying in bed, drenched in sweat, I tried to make sense of what I had seen. Did they really show me the past? And that creature almost destroyed an entire civilization. What should I do? I got up and suddenly heard a noise. Opening the door, I saw a fleeing man screaming in terror. What was he running from? I quickly got dressed and headed outside. Upon entering the main hall, I noticed bodies lying everywhere. What the hell happened? Suddenly, I saw movement on one of the bodies and saw the creature crawling out of it. I took a step back and realized that these creatures had begun crawling from all sides. There were hundreds of them, and they were all crawling toward me. I turned around and ran. Fear paralyzed me, but I tried to think. I remembered that they were afraid of fire and headed toward the cafeteria. Running inside, I immediately ran to the kitchen. There, grabbing a gas cylinder, I disconnected it from the stove, leaving only the hose, and then grabbed some matches. Soon I found a lighter. These creatures were getting closer, and I stood ready, After opening the valve, I aimed the hose at these creatures and lit the fire. A stream of flames engulfed these centipedes, causing them to emit a nasty squeal that pierced to the bone. After dealing with them, I ran outside. Suddenly a siren sounded, and a voice announced an evacuation. Everyone was ordered to head to the lifeboats. Emerging outside, where the storm was raging, I noticed Henry, who was running toward me. I showed him the enclosed place, and we ran there, hiding from the storm. There I told him about the dream, and that we had to do something about that creature. Otherwise, humanity would be in danger. We didn't think for long, but decided to blow up this place. Fortunately, we knew how to do it, and the platform itself was one of the most explosive places. When we ran outside and headed to the drilling compartment, we saw the vampire flying in search of prey. Suddenly, he dived down and grabbed some poor soul. Because of the storm, we couldn't hear the screams, but we knew they were in danger. The ringing continued until now. Apparently, the coffin was still below. The storm raged with unabated fury. The wind whistled in our ears, and the rain beating on our faces resembled thousands of lashes. We could barely see each other through the thick veil of sea fog and rain, but our silhouettes served as guides to each other in this chaos. Suddenly, a shadow passed over us. The creature spotted us and, abandoning its prey, chased after us. Its eyes glowed like coals, and its teeth gleamed in the dim light of our flashlights. We ran, trying to keep our footing on the slippery metal platform, which seemed more like a roller rink than a reliable surface. With every gust of wind, we felt its breath, and with every rustle, its wings. Moving was extremely difficult. The storm made it hard to breathe, and the wind repeatedly tried to knock us off our feet. At one point, when we were very close to the drilling compartment, the creature made a sudden lunge forward, and its claws barely missed me. I felt its cold breath in the air. Henry, seeing the danger, shoved me aside sharply, and we fell onto the wet steel, sliding toward the compartment. Reaching the entrance, we struggled to close the door behind us, hearing the creature's wings beating against the metal. Now we were relatively safe, but there was no time for respite. But this peace turned out to be short-lived. The vampire, undeterred, began to batter the window of the drilling compartment. The sound of glass squealing under the brute force of the beast didn't bode well. At one moment, the glass couldn't hold, and with a roar, the creature burst inside. Instinctively, Henry and I dashed deeper into the compartment. The creature soared in the air, trying to catch up with us, but we were faster. Running into the corridor, we lured it after us and managed to lure it into one of the isolation chambers. Suddenly, veering to the right, the creature burst into the chamber after us and flew past. We jumped out at the last moment, slamming the door behind us. The vampire's momentary hesitation gave us the necessary advantage. We could hear it thrashing and scratching the metal inside the chamber, trying to break free. However, time was working against us. Moving quickly through the drilling compartment, we set up the drilling rig in such a way as to create excessive pressure in the system. We knew that this maneuver, although extremely dangerous, had to lead to a devastating explosion that would destroy the platform, and we hoped the creature along with it. All the settings were done, and the drill mechanism started its work, gradually increasing the pressure in the system. After completing the preparation, we rushed to the lifeboats. The storm was still raging outside. The sea's turmoil didn't abate, and every step toward salvation was heavy and risky. Battling the rain and wind, we made our way to the rescue station, hearing the increasing roar of the working drilling rig behind us. The sound of mounting pressure in the rig filled the air, like a harbinger of the impending explosion. We reached the lifeboats where Meister Blackwood was waiting for people, but apparently we were the last ones. We explained our plan to him, after which he shouted for everyone to get ready. Then we climbed into the orange lifeboat, which resembled a submarine. We were ready to depart when we saw one of the doctors running toward us, meaning someone else was still there. But suddenly he fell, and we noticed that many of those creatures were crawling on him, some of them crawling right into his ears. I grabbed the chief, who was staring at this scene in dismay, and dragged him into the rescue lifeboat. Pulling the lever, the lifeboat fell straight into the ocean when suddenly an explosion occurred. We were thrown, and the waves dragged us into the sea. Looking through a small window, I watched the platform burning and heard a horrifying scream coming from there. I don't know if we managed to kill that creature, but at least we did everything we could.
Story 2.
We had been driving for several hours when the forest started to thicken, obscuring the sky. The road became narrower and more winding until our old Jeep finally stopped at the edge of a small clearing. Tom, Lisa, and I had decided to spend the weekend away from the city hustle, far from worries and problems, in one of the country's densest forests. Stepping out of the car, I inhaled the cool, fresh air filled with the scents of pine and damp earth. Birds chirped in the tree canopies, and somewhere in the distance a stream gurgled. Here, far from civilization, everything felt different, somehow primordial and wild. Tom, our driver and avid nature lover, was already pulling our backpacks and tent out of the trunk. His short blonde hair gleamed in the sun, and a satisfied smile played on his face. Lisa, with her long dark hair and a camera in hand, was trying to capture every moment of our journey. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and I felt excitement beginning to take hold of me. We started our hike, venturing deeper into the forest. The path underfoot seemed barely trodden, adding to its mystery. Leaves rustled underfoot, and sunlight pierced through the tree canopies in rare golden rays. The forest around us was so dense that it felt like we were stepping into another world, separated from reality. As we progressed, Tom told us stories about this forest, its wildlife, and the rare animals that lived here. Lisa, in turn, took pictures and asked questions, intrigued by every bush and tree. I walked behind, savoring the moment and feeling the city's hustle slowly dissolve into this green ocean. Time passed unnoticed, and when we finally reached the place where we planned to set up camp, the sun was already setting. We stopped at a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and began setting up the tent. Lisa started a fire while I pulled out food and utensils from my backpack. Nightfall in the forest came quickly. The sounds of nature became more distinct, and the forest filled with nocturnal life. We sat by the campfire, enjoying its warmth and coziness, when Lisa suggested we tell each other scary stories. In the dark, among the shadows and rustlings of the forest, the idea seemed especially appealing. Tom started first. His voice was deep and ominous, telling of an old abandoned house supposedly haunted by ghosts. We listened, holding our breath, when we suddenly heard a strange noise coming from the forest. The noise was quiet, almost imperceptible, but clearly different from the usual sounds of the night forest. We exchanged glances, and anxiety began to slowly fill our hearts. Tom, still holding the flashlight, stood up and suggested we check out what it could be. Reluctantly, but driven by curiosity, we followed him. Our flashlights illuminated our path, dispelling the darkness but not calming our fear. We walked through the forest, and it seemed like the trees were closing in around us, their branches whispering something unintelligible and shadows dancing, resembling bizarre figures. Occasionally, we heard some sounds, the crunch of branches underfoot, a distant howl resembling a cry. Every step felt perilous, and we felt the tension rising. Suddenly, through the dense thicket, we saw a faint light. We pointed our flashlights in that direction, and after walking a bit further, we came to a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood an old cabin. It was small and clearly abandoned, with peeling paint on the walls and a sagging roof. The windows were dark and looked like empty eye sockets staring straight at us. The half-open door creaked in the wind, emitting a sinister sound. The cabin looked like no one had been here for many years. The roof had caved in places, shrubs entwined the walls, and the grass around it was tall and thick. The windows, covered in dust and cobwebs, let in no light. The dim moonlight only added to the mystical and eerie atmosphere of this place. We stood before the cabin, examining it, and our fear slowly gave way to curiosity. Something about this place drew us in, and we couldn't just leave. Tom, the first to overcome his fears, headed towards the door, and holding our breath, we followed him. We approached slowly and cautiously, the flashlight beams trembling in our hands. When we got close enough, we noticed that the door handle was unusual. It was massive, made of dark, polished metal, with intricate patterns resembling ancient symbols. The handle looked like it belonged to another time, some distant and mysterious past. Tom carefully touched the handle, and we all held our breath. With a slight creak, the door yielded and began to open. We stood tense, ready for anything. But what we saw inside shook us to our core. Beyond the threshold was not the dark and dusty interior we expected to see. Instead, a huge, luxurious mansion stretched before us. High ceilings were adorned with magnificent chandeliers sparkling with crystals. The walls were covered in rich fabric and decorated with paintings in golden frames. Marble floors gleamed in the light of numerous lamps, and at the far end of the spacious hall, a grand staircase led to the second floor. We stood in astonishment, unable to believe our eyes. I turned to look at the house from the outside. Through the open door, I saw the same small, dilapidated cabin standing in the middle of the forest. Inside, however, we were surrounded by luxury, as if we had entered another world, another reality. "How is this possible?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. Tom looked like he was trying to find a logical explanation for what was happening, but clearly couldn't. I felt fear and curiosity battling within me. This place beckoned us, calling us to explore its mysteries. "What do you think? Should we look around?" Tom asked uncertainly. We exchanged glances, and although we were scared, we decided to enter. The floor underfoot was cool and smooth, and the air inside the mansion felt heavy and old. We cautiously explored the mansion, marveling at its grandeur, while simultaneously feeling a growing sense of dread. The first thing we noticed was the mirrors. They hung in every room, large and small, and seemed to reflect not only our images, but something strange, hidden deep within. Sometimes, as I passed another mirror, I caught glimpses of shadows that disappeared as soon as I turned. This added to the mystery and anxiety. We walked through the luxurious hall and found ourselves in a spacious living room decorated with antique furniture. Tall windows were draped with heavy velvet curtains, and soft carpets with intricate patterns lay on the floor. An enormous fireplace, covered in carvings, occupied almost an entire wall. Shelves were lined with antique books and strange, exotic figurines. As we examined the room, things started to seem increasingly odd. The books on the shelves appeared too new for such an old house. They were in perfect condition, as if they had never been opened. In one corner stood an antique gramophone, which suddenly began to play by itself, emitting a quiet, melodic, yet eerie tune. We approached and saw that the record wasn't spinning. We moved from room to room, and the oddities continued to follow us. In one of the bedrooms, wardrobe doors started to open and close on their own, as if someone invisible was trying to get out. In the dining room, set for a feast, the food looked fresh, but there was no sign of anyone who might have prepared it. The air was filled with a faint scent of roses mixed with something more musty and unpleasant. Every new step through the house filled us with a sense of an unseen presence, some malevolent spirit inhabiting this place. We felt a cold emanating from the walls, penetrating straight to our bones. Our hearts beat faster, and we were no longer sure if we should continue exploring. Suddenly we heard a cry for help. It was faint but distinct, as if someone was shouting from far away, making it hard to determine where the sound was coming from. We froze, listening to the voice echoing through the mansion's walls. Fear and anxiety overwhelmed us. "Did you hear that?" whispered Lisa, her eyes wide with horror. Tom nodded, trying to pinpoint the direction of the voice. "It sounded ghostly," he muttered, looking around. We stood in the living room, unsure of where to go. The voice seemed to come closer and then farther away, as if playing with us, luring us deeper into the sinister house. The shadows on the walls seemed alive, and it felt like something terrifying was lurking in every corner. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out. Complete darkness enveloped us, and at that moment, the house filled with a terrible, piercing roar that made us freeze in place. Lisa screamed in fear and Tom gasped. "Run!" I shouted, and we all dashed towards the exit. The darkness and the roar consumed us as we frantically tried to find our way back through the now endless and confusing corridors and rooms. As we ran past the mirrors, I noticed strange silhouettes. In the reflections, I saw the figure of a wolf, or rather, a man turned into a wolf. His eyes glowed in the dim light, filled with rage and malevolent power. It was a werewolf. Each time we passed another mirror, the image of the werewolf became more distinct. His powerful body, covered in thick, dark fur, and the fierce expression on his face were terrifying. In the mirrors, he moved with us like a sinister shadow, pursuing us closely. His claws were long and sharp, and his mouth was full of dagger-like teeth, ready to tear us apart at any moment. In panic, we ran down the stairs. For some reason, I decided to look back and saw in the moonlight streaming through the window a shadow rapidly approaching us. It was the werewolf. His eyes burned with wild fury, and his mouth was slightly open, revealing sharp knife-like teeth. He let out a growl that made our blood run cold. "Faster!" Tom shouted, and we ran on, trying to escape the monster. The werewolf lunged after us, his claws scraping against the wooden steps, creating a sound that made our hair stand on end. We ran without looking back, feeling his breath on our necks. Our hearts pounded in a frantic rhythm, and fear drove us forward. We rushed towards the exit, feeling the werewolf almost catching up to us. Tom was the first to reach the door and flung it open with force. But instead of the saving forest, we saw another room beyond the door. Our hearts sank in horror. In front of us was not a moonlit clearing, but a dark, neglected hut. We exchanged glances, realizing there was no way out. The werewolf was too close, and we had no choice but to enter. We dashed into the hut and quickly slammed the door behind us, locking it with a heavy bolt. The noise and roar of the werewolf ceased as if we had entered another place. Breathing a sigh of relief, we looked around. The hut was small and abandoned. Through broken windows, faint moonlight streamed in, casting long shadows on the floor. The old, dust-covered wooden walls creaked in the wind. The ceiling was low and blackened from time and moisture. In the corners stood old, half-ruined cupboards, with torn books and broken items peeking out. On the floor lay a dirty, worn-out rug, torn and faded in places. In the center of the room stood a wooden table with 3 chairs, one of which was overturned. Empty bottles and candle holders, long devoid of candles, were scattered on the table. In one corner was an old stove that hadn't seen a fire in ages. A musty smell emanated from it, filling the room with a sense of abandonment and hopelessness. Suddenly, the silence seemed threatening. We stood, trying to catch our breath and figure out what to do next. Our hearts still pounded from the recent fear and running. Lisa sat on one of the chairs, her hands trembling and her eyes full of horror. Tom looked around, trying to find any exit or clue on where to go. "What is this place?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Tom replied, rummaging through the cupboards and looking behind corners. "But we need to be careful. Something is definitely wrong here." We continued examining the hut when Tom found some old photographs on the wall. One particularly caught his attention. It showed a boy and his mother. I stepped closer and took the photograph in my hands. As I looked at it, something strange and horrifying happened. Before my eyes, the photograph came to life. The boy and the woman on it began to age rapidly, their skin wrinkling and thinning until it turned to ash. Their faces contorted in agony, and they started screaming for help. Their cries were piercing and heart-wrenching. I screamed in horror and dropped the photograph. "What happened?" Lisa asked fearfully, running over to me. I, trembling, pointed at the photograph lying on the floor. Tom picked it up and we all looked at the picture. Now the photograph depicted skeletons standing in the same pose as the boy and his mother before. Their empty eye sockets seemed bottomless and cold. We looked at each other in fear, not knowing what to do next. Our hearts pounded in our chests, and the fear became almost palpable. "Something is definitely wrong here," Tom whispered, his voice shaking. We decided to keep exploring, hoping to find some clue. In one of the cupboards, we found an old scrap of a letter. Written in a shaky hand were the words, "Soon my experiment will be over, and I will save you, Mom." As we read this, strange sounds started emanating in the room. The windows were boarded up, and the moonlight barely seeped through the cracks. The sounds came from the corners of the room, a quiet, insistent whisper, as if someone was trying to tell us something. The whisper grew louder and clearer, creating a creepy feeling that we were not alone in this place. We stood frozen, listening to these whispers, feeling cold shivers running down our spines. It felt like the walls of the hut were closing in, and the shadows around us were growing thicker and more alive. The fear we felt was all-consuming, and it seemed like time had stopped. "We need to get out of here," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. I also thought we needed to leave. The only exit we saw was through the same door we entered, but the werewolf could be out there, I approached the door and listened, trying to catch any sound, but it was quiet outside. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the tension rising with each passing second. "We need to try," I whispered, turning to my friends. "We have no other choice." I slowly and cautiously took hold of the door handle, trying not to make a sound. Then, taking a deep breath, I quietly opened the door and peeked inside. Before us was a new room. It was an old library. Inside the library was dim light, interrupted only by the faint glow seeping through the boarded-up windows. The dusty, musty atmosphere was filled with the scent of old books and wood rot. Tall, wooden shelves filled with books reached the ceiling, forming a labyrinth of books and manuscripts. On some shelves lay stacks of yellowed documents and scrolls, tied with faded ribbons. In the center of the room stood a large oak table covered in a layer of dust. Scattered papers, old quills, and inkwells lay on the table. In one corner stood an old globe covered in cobwebs. The flat lamps hanging from the ceiling had long stopped glowing, adding even more gloom to the library. In the corners of the room were old armchairs and reading tables upholstered in cracked leather. On the walls hung portraits of people in heavy, gilded frames. The faces in the portraits were stern and wary, their gazes seeming to follow us wherever we went. We slowly entered the library, our footsteps echoing dully in the room's silence. The air was filled with a faint, barely perceptible whisper, as if the old books themselves were telling their stories. "This place feels like it's from another era," whispered Lisa, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. I approached one of the shelves, and my gaze fell upon a book with a black cover. The cover was adorned with sinister symbols and intricate patterns. I carefully took the book and opened it. On the first page it read Necromancy Handbook. I began to flip through the pages, and with each turn the sense of dread only intensified. The pages of the book depicted horrifying rituals and described spells for raising the dead, summoning spirits, and communicating with dark forces. Drawings of ritual circles, pentagrams, and terrifying creatures made my blood run cold. I felt cold sweat break out on my forehead, and my hands began to tremble. I closed the book and looked around. Many other books on the shelves were also related to dark arts. The titles on the spines spoke of demonology, alchemy, black magic, and other grim subjects. The very atmosphere of the library seemed to be steeped in sinister energy, and each new discovery only heightened our unease. "Everything here is related to black magic," I whispered to my friends. "We need to be very careful." We started walking around the library, trying to find any way out. Every shelf, every corner was filled with strange and frightening books. We were looking for a secret door or some passage, but found nothing. The feeling of hopelessness and fear grew stronger. We continued examining the library when suddenly we heard Lisa's frightened voice. "Guys, come here!" Her voice trembled, and she was pointing at a book lying on the table. I approached and read the title on the cover. 3 Uninvited Guests Doomed to Die. We exchanged glances, and fear reflected in our eyes. Tom took the book and opened it, and we began to read. To our horror, the book described our adventure, how we arrived in the forest, found this house, and started exploring it. "This is impossible," Tom whispered, his voice shaking. We kept reading, and our fears only grew. The book described another person who had been watching us all this time. Reading this, we nervously looked around, trying to find who could be observing us. But we saw no one. "What the hell is going on here?" Lisa whispered nervously. We continued reading and reached the part where it described us standing in the library. To our horror, New entries began to appear before our eyes. They said that while we were reading, a werewolf was sneaking up on us from around the corner. "No, this can't be true," Tom exclaimed, his face pale. Our hearts were pounding and panic began to overtake us. We slowly turned around and saw a shadow approaching us from around the corner. It was the werewolf, and his eyes gleamed with malice and fury. "Run!" I shouted, and we all dashed towards the exit. We ran, stumbling and bumping into shelves, books falling to the floor, scattering pages everywhere. The sounds of our footsteps and the clatter of falling books echoed through the library. We didn't look back, knowing the werewolf was chasing us, his growls and heavy breathing getting closer. We ran, feeling panic gripping us more with each second. The sounds of our footsteps echoed loudly in the library, mingling with the crash of falling books. The werewolf's heavy breathing and growls were getting closer, like the shadow of death pursuing us. Ahead, in the dim light of our flashlights, we saw a door. It was our only chance for salvation. "Faster this way!" Tom shouted, and we, without slowing down, headed for the door. Reaching it, I pushed it open with all my might, and it creaked as it swung open. We burst inside, nearly falling over each other, and immediately slammed the door shut behind us. As soon as the door closed, the noise stopped as if we had teleported to another place. Inside, we looked around and saw that we had entered a laboratory. The room was dimly lit by several flickering lamps, creating a creepy atmosphere. Old laboratory tables covered in layers of dust and scattered instruments stood everywhere. Glass flasks, test tubes, and retorts filled with colorful liquids were on shelves and tables, as if waiting to be used again. The walls were lined with shelves of books and manuscripts, most of which were covered in mysterious symbols and formulas. In the corner of the room stood a large metal table with straps for restraint, reminiscent of an operating table. Lamps hung above it, casting a dim light. The air was filled with a sharp smell of chemicals and something rotten. On one of the tables, we noticed an old microscope and numerous scattered notes. In the center of the laboratory stood a massive wooden table with ancient books on it, one of which was open, its pages covered with ancient spells and drawings. "What is this place?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. We continued to explore the laboratory, trying to find any clue about what was happening here. On one of the tables, we noticed an old, worn-out diary. The cover was frayed, and the pages had yellowed with age. We opened it and began reading the entries made in a shaky hand. Asterisk. Asterisk. First entry. My research on resurrecting dead animals continues. Today I tried to bring a wolf back to life, but all my efforts were in vain. All known methods yielded no results. The wolf remained dead despite all my efforts. Asterisk, asterisk, second entry. In desperation, I turned to a man known in certain circles as a master of black magic. His knowledge and methods were dangerous and forbidden, but I had no choice. He suggested incorporating elements of black magic into my experiments. Asterisk. Asterisk. Third entry. The result was astounding. Today, I was able to resurrect the wolf using the spells and rituals suggested by this man. The wolf came back to life and lived for half an hour before dying again. This was an incredible success, but also a challenge. I realized that I was now on the verge of a discovery that could change everything. Asterisk, asterisk, fourth entry. I continued my experiments, trying to understand how to prolong the life of the resurrected creature. Each time I used increasingly complex spells and rituals, added new components, and altered methods. The results were unpredictable, but progress was undeniable. The wolf lived longer, but something in its eyes frightened me. They became inhuman, full of rage and malice. We didn't learn what happened next, as the entries ended at the most intriguing moment. "This is horrible," Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to be very careful," Tom added. "We don't know what else might be hiding here." Just as he said this, we heard a noise coming from the far end of the laboratory. Our hearts started pounding again, and I thought, what now? We watched the darkness warily, ready for anything. Suddenly, a man emerged from the shadows. He looked exhausted and haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and disheveled hair. He wore old, worn-out clothes that had clearly seen better days. His face was covered in stubble, and his eyes expressed a mix of fatigue and despair. He slowly raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. "Please, don't be afraid," he said in a quiet, calming voice. "I'm not dangerous." We stood warily, watching his every move. He approached, but stopped at a safe distance, understanding our mistrust. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "My name is Edgar," he replied. "Like you, I stumbled upon this place and couldn't find a way out. I've been here for a long time trying to escape, but this house, it won't let me." Edgar began to tell his story, and with each word we felt more of the horror he had experienced. "Several months ago, I came to this forest to study the local flora. I'm a biologist and have always loved exploring nature. One day, I stumbled upon this house. At first, it seemed like an ordinary abandoned building, but inside, I found something incredible. I couldn't resist the temptation to explore it, and that was my mistake." Edgar sighed heavily and continued, "As soon as I entered, the house seemed to come alive. The doors and corridors began to change. I tried to leave, but each time I ended up in a new room. At first, I found this laboratory and realized that strange experiments were conducted here. I read the diaries of a scientist who tried to resurrect the dead. His experiments got out of control, and now the house is filled with dark magic and ghosts." We listened to him, holding our breath, realizing that Edgar had fallen into the same trap as us. "I tried to find a way out," he continued, "but every time the house brought me back. The only thing I've learned is to be careful. Everything here can be dangerous. And now you're here. Maybe together we have a chance to escape." Edgar seemed sincere, and his story sounded plausible. We exchanged glances, realizing that we now had an ally in this nightmare. Perhaps together we could find a way out of this sinister house. I asked Edgar if he had any ideas on how to get out of here. He shook his head, his face thoughtful and sad. "Honestly, I don't know," he replied. "But there's one more door I haven't had a chance to explore. I recently found this laboratory and didn't have time to check everything around." We were surprised to hear this. "What door?" Tom asked. Edgar gestured for us to follow him. We walked through the laboratory to a far wall where, behind an old cabinet almost hidden from view, there indeed was a door. It was old and massive, with a rusty iron lock. "Here," he said, pointing to it. "I haven't had a chance to explore it. Maybe it leads somewhere outside." Our hearts pounded with hope. Tom approached the door and, with effort, opened it. Behind the door we saw a narrow passage leading down. We turned on our flashlights and began descending the old, creaky stairs. With each step, the darkness grew thicker and the air grew colder. The stairs seemed endless, and each step emitted an ominous creak. We moved cautiously, lighting our way with flashlights until we reached the bottom. Before us opened a basement that looked like an ancient temple. The room was enormous, with rough stone walls and ceiling covered in old, darkened frescoes and symbols. In the center of the room stood a massive altar, surrounded by stone columns engraved with mysterious signs and images. Ritual circles and pentagrams were drawn on the floor, some glowing with a dim, sinister light. In the corners of the room stood tall statues depicting ancient gods or demons, their eyes seeming alive and following our every move. The air was filled with the smell of dampness and something ancient, as if we were in a place long forgotten by people. We began to explore this ancient underground room, examining the symbols and old objects. Soon, our attention was drawn to 5 cubes scattered in a circle. They were made of dark stone, covered with strange inscriptions and symbols, barely visible in the dim flashlight light. "What could they be for?" Lisa asked, examining one of the cubes. Tom thoughtfully looked around. "Maybe it's part of some ritual," he suggested. "What if they need to be gathered and placed in the pentagram?" Edgar proposed, pointing to the glowing signs on the floor. I immediately disliked the idea. Something about it seemed wrong and dangerous. But my friends were determined. "Let's try it," Lisa said, addressing Tom and Edgar. "Maybe it will help us understand what's going on." I stood aside, watching them prepare to execute the plan. Each cube had inscriptions that seemed to indicate its place in the ritual circle. They began deciphering the inscriptions, trying to figure out which cube went where. While they were busy, I decided to open the book I'd kept with me all this time. It was the same book that described our adventures. I sat on a stone ledge and began to read. The pages turned by themselves, as if the book was guiding me to the right section. I read the book while my friends arranged the cubes in the pentagram. The book described all our actions, and I was horrified to realize that every move we made was predicted. Suddenly, among the lines, I noticed something new. A description of a werewolf sneaking down the stairs to the underground sanctuary. He was desperate, and bitter memories of the past flashed through his mind. His name was Marcus, and he was his mother's only son. He loved her more than anything. She was his world, his support, and inspiration. But one day, in a fateful moment, she died under mysterious circumstances. Marcus swore to himself that he would do everything possible to bring her back. Years passed, filled with study and research. He studied sciences, alchemy, anything that could help him achieve his goal. But nothing worked. In desperation, he met a man who offered him the path of dark magic. This man, Edgar, claimed to have the knowledge and power to bring the dead back to life. With his help, Marcus's research progressed. He saw progress, but his suspicions grew as well. Edgar increasingly reminded him of a tool of dark forces, and one day he declared that he had found a ritual worth trying. And they set to work. When the ritual was almost complete, Marcus felt something was wrong. The air filled with sinister energy, and he realized something terrible was happening. At the last moment, he intervened and interrupted the ritual. There was a powerful explosion, turning this place into a trap and Marcus himself into a werewolf. Only then did he realize that Edgar had used him for his purposes, to summon something terrifying into this world. Fortunately, it didn't succeed, but now they were both trapped in this cursed place. Marcus found out that Edgar was a demon seeking power and destruction. Since then, they had been constantly fighting each other, each trying to outwit the other. Now Marcus was worried, seeing us new people coming to this place. He wondered what Edgar had planned this time and what role we played in his schemes. I finished reading this part of the book and felt cold sweat running down my forehead. The werewolf Marcus was desperate and eager to break free from the curse. I looked up and saw my friends Lisa and Tom finishing placing the cubes. The pentagram began to glow, and I realized that we had very little time left. "Stop!" I shouted, but it was too late. The cubes were in place, and the light from the pentagram grew brighter. I knew we had to act quickly, or we would become part of this sinister story forever. The pentagram glowed brighter with each second, and the air filled with whispers and howls, as if invisible spirits had gathered around us. The floor beneath our feet began to vibrate, and we felt an invisible force pulling us toward the center of the ritual. Our hearts pounded with terror and anticipation of the inevitable. The three of us looked at each other, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, ghostly figures of people began to appear around us. Their semi-transparent bodies were mutilated, and their faces expressed torment and suffering. These were the victims of Edgar's experiments, souls trapped in this cursed place. They tried to warn us, their mouths opening, but their words were distorted and unintelligible, as if through a thick veil. We felt their despair and pain, their desire for us to leave this place before it was too late. At that moment, the werewolf burst into the room. His eyes blazed with fury and desperation. He charged toward the center of the pentagram, trying to destroy it, growling loudly. Before we could understand what was happening, Edgar emerged from the shadows. But he was no longer a man. He was a demon. His eyes gleamed with malice, and a sinister smile played on his face. He laughed and mocked our attempts to resist. "Fools," Edgar said, his voice full of malice and contempt. We stood frozen, realizing the depth of the horror we were in. The werewolf, without waiting for our reaction, lunged at Edgar, starting a fierce and brutal fight. Every blow and movement could decide the outcome. We knew we had to help. Tom and I began searching for something that could weaken the demon. We ran to the cubes, which were now floating in the air, and tried to move them, but nothing worked. Lisa was also running around and suddenly screamed that she understood what to do. With trembling hands, she activated an artifact. The pentagram began to fade, and the light grew dimmer. Edgar, realizing he was losing control, roared in rage and rushed at us. "No!" he shouted. "You don't understand what you're doing!" But it was too late. The pentagram started to collapse, and with it the power fueling Edgar began to disappear. He started losing his demonic form, reverting to a human, his face contorted in pain and hatred. "You'll regret this," he whispered, vanishing in a cloud of black smoke. As the pentagram disintegrated, there was a powerful explosion that threw us in different directions. I felt the ground give way beneath me, and everything went dark. I lost consciousness. When I came to, I found myself lying on soft grass. I slowly opened my eyes and saw that I was in the middle of the forest. The sun was shining through the tree canopies, and everything seemed so calm and peaceful. I struggled to my feet, feeling pain all over my body. Looking around, I saw Lisa and Tom, also regaining consciousness nearby. "What happened?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. We looked at each other in fright, trying to understand where we were. Where the sinister house once stood, there was now nothing. The place was overgrown with grass and trees as if it had never existed. The air was filled with the scent of fresh greenery and blooming plants. "This is impossible," Tom said, looking around. "We need to get out of here." We started moving towards where we had left the car. When we reached it, we were horrified. The car was covered in rust. Its window shattered, and it looked like it hadn't been used in hundreds of years. Grass and shrubs grew around and even through the car, as if nature had reclaimed it. "Something's wrong here," I said, feeling cold sweat run down my back. "We've only been here a few hours." "But it looks like a century has passed," added Lisa, her voice shaking. We realized that our sense of time and reality had been distorted. We were terrified, unable to explain what had happened. A feeling of hopelessness and fear grew within us. "We need to walk," Tom said, trying to stay calm. "We have to find a way out of this forest." With those words, we started walking towards the edge of the forest, feeling the persistent fear with every step. The forest, which once seemed ordinary, now appeared sinister and mysterious. The shadows of the trees seemed longer, and the sounds of nature resembled ghostly whispers. We walked, trying to stay together and not fall behind. Time stretched endlessly, and each step was difficult. Thoughts of what had happened haunted us, and each of us silently tried to comprehend what had really occurred. When we finally reached the forest's edge, we saw a world that looked familiar yet alien. We were saved, but what we had experienced left an indelible mark on our hearts. We knew we had to continue living, but the memories of that sinister house and its secrets would haunt us for a long time.
Story 3.
"Mary, my dear, please put the knife down." I slowly back away. "Mary, do you hear me? I'm your husband, remember, I love you, Mary." I try to calm my wife. She lowers her head wearing a nightgown, clutching a large kitchen knife, trembling and shuffling her feet heavily. "Mary, are you still with me? I know you can hear me." "Mary, no, please, stop, Mary," I scream. But it's useless. She's gone, left me forever. My wife is no more. In her place is an empty shell, a body without a soul. I hear a repulsive sound, the crunch of bones, and watch as her limbs lengthen, bending into grotesque and unnatural shapes. Thick, dark red blood starts to flow from her body, and her face is covered with white-pink blisters. Her beautiful chestnut hair falls onto the wooden floor, leaving her bald before my eyes. Mary wheezes heavily, then begins to moo like an animal. She's no longer human. Before me stands a mutant, a half-dog, half-human creature. And this creature is ravenous. It lifts its lifeless, glassy eyes to me and starts sniffing. The monster senses my scent. It's ready to tear me apart at any moment to devour me. But I can't move. I'm in shock. I want to scream, to cry. I'm furious and disoriented. I don't understand how this could have happened. I've lost her, the only person I loved with all my heart. I was warned. I knew this could happen. But why didn't I save her? Make a plan. Think about Mary. I see the creature wheezing, slowly approaching me. I snap back to reality and begin to retreat. The mutant senses it. It knows I'm trying to escape. The mutant starts making sounds, trying to speak, and I hear Mary's voice. "Save me." Wheezing, mooing, and again. "Save me." Wheezing, it growls like an animal. And again my wife's voice. She begs me and screams, "Save, save, save." I cover my ears, and at that moment, the mutant grabs my leg. I fall and remember how it all began. It was raining that day. Mary had gone to the hospital for a night shift. She was a doctor, and I was home alone. It was already late at night, and I was getting ready to go to bed when there was a knock at the door. As usual, I checked the surveillance camera I had installed outside and saw a strange man on the porch. He looked very disheveled, like a homeless person, wearing an old, crumpled coat and boots. His eyes made me very uneasy. They seemed insane. He was muttering something and looked extremely nervous. I approached the door and started speaking loudly, telling him to leave or I would call the police. However, the night visitor continued to mutter and knock on the door. I repeated my threats. Then he took a smartphone out of his pocket and started showing it to the camera. I heard his voice. "Harry, take it. It's dangerous, but you'll understand. Save yourself. Us. Harry." I don't have much time left. I was surprised and agitated. He knew my name. But who was this man? Why did he want me to take the smartphone? I looked through the surveillance camera again and saw him staring intently into it. His facial features seemed familiar to me. Very thin, with stubble, but he vaguely reminded me of my late father. At some point, the night visitor began to smile and started speaking loudly. "Smells like something's burning. Smells like something's burning. Smells like burning." Then he suddenly started laughing loudly like a madman. It didn't last long, just a few minutes, and then he stopped laughing and lowered his head. I was about to call the police when I heard his voice again. "Forgive me for everything, Harry," the night visitor said, looking intently at the camera once more. I saw him pull out a gun, press it to his temple, and bam! I was terrified, fell to my knees, and closed my eyes. But when I looked at the camera again, he was gone. Then I gathered my courage and opened the door. As expected, there was no corpse on the floor. The night visitor had vanished, leaving only the smartphone as proof that it hadn't all been a hallucination. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought long and hard about whether I should call the police. Perhaps there was a dangerous madman with a firearm wandering around the neighborhood. But I felt that it wasn't so simple, and what I had seen and heard that night was the beginning of something horrifying. Something was coming, and my anxiety only grew. I kept asking myself questions. Why did this man look so much like my father? Why was he acting so strangely? And what about the smartphone? I had never seen such a model before. Morning came without me noticing. I decided not to go to work this time. It was irresponsible of me, but I hadn't slept all night, and to be honest, I wouldn't be of much use. So I called my boss and took the day off. I wanted to wait for Mary and tell her what had happened last night. Mary came back early. She was very tired, upset, and went straight to take a shower. I figured she was upset because of work. Something unpleasant must have happened. I started making breakfast and, while waiting for my wife, turned on the TV out of habit. The news was on. A clean-shaven anchor in an expensive suit with a serious face was reporting on another fire, floods, attacks, criminals, and the police. Economic growth had slowed, major company stocks had crashed, and a new disease had been identified in a country with a complicated name. One news story followed another as I watched with a sleepy gaze, chewing on a burnt toast. At some point, an advertisement for a new smartphone caught my attention. The model of the future, multifunctional and ultra-thin, with 2 frameless screens coming soon. I heard from the TV, but I couldn't believe it. This smartphone, this model, I had already seen it. Something similar was lying in my nightstand drawer. I hurried to the bedroom to make sure it was indeed the same smartphone the night visitor had brought yesterday. Mary had already gotten out of the shower and was drying her hair. She was slightly surprised by my behavior when I burst into the bedroom like a madman and started rummaging through the nightstand. "What's wrong, dear?" Mary asked me. I pulled out the smartphone and started waving it in front of her, telling her what had happened last night. Mary was a little scared and agitated. She began asking me what was on the smartphone. Of course, I hadn't turned it on and didn't know, but I was intensely curious. So I sat on the bed and turned on the smartphone. At first glance, it was an ordinary smartphone with a slightly worn screen, dusty and smudged with dirt in places. But what I found in the media section alarmed me greatly. There were many videos and photos of humanoid creatures, the kind you see in sci-fi movies. Mary felt uncomfortable looking at them, so I decided to postpone viewing the photos and read the messages instead. The first one was dated March 12th, 2026. In it, someone named Albert wrote to the phone's owner that he found the mutations beautiful, and his research proved that they had finally made a breakthrough. The second message came from someone named Jiro on March 26th, 2026, and he wrote, "There are few of us left. Every day someone disappears or just leaves. I'm losing friends, valuable doctors and scientists. Last week, our dear Ayame got infected. She's in quarantine now, and she knows it's the end. The soldiers are very scared. They're nervous, and if it weren't for the captain and the government's orders, I think we would have been shot." The next message from Jiro came in March. "I've sent you the data. It's all we managed to do. Ayame is dead. The captain killed himself in the bathroom. There's no news from the government. They're keeping us in the lab. I don't know what's happening outside. The soldiers aren't saying anything. They're going crazy. I feel like I'll have to leave soon too. Forgive me, we ran out of time." There were no more messages from Jiro. After finishing reading, I set the smartphone aside and looked at Mary. She was also confused, but it was hard for us to believe that both the phone and all the messages on it were from the future. It all seemed like science fiction or a prank. So we decided it was best to go to the police and hand over the smartphone. However, before calling the police, I decided to dig a little more into the phone. Mary said she was very tired and went to bed. I didn't want to disturb her further, so I took the phone and went down to the living room to watch the videos and photos alone. The first video that caught my attention was about animals. It was footage from surveillance cameras dated December 17th, 2025. The recording was taken in a long, bright room, lined with cages along the walls, housing monkeys, dogs, cats, and rats, with a large iron table in the center. There were 2 people in the room, their faces covered by masks, and they were dressed head to toe in protective suits of a white-yellowish color. One of the scientists seemed to be a fan of classical music, as Beethoven's Ninth Symphony played in the laboratory. They moved from cage to cage, sprinkling and injecting something into the animals. The strangest thing I noticed was that the animals were silent. No sounds of barking, growling, or monkey chatter. Absolute silence. Yet, the video showed that all the animals were alive and occasionally moving in their cages. The next video was dated January 3rd, 2026. The same laboratory, but now there were more scientists. In masks and protective suits, they gathered around the table on which lay the corpse of a monkey, its arms and legs spread out, and its entire abdomen from neck to thigh was split open. The scientists were talking amongst themselves. One of them was loudly cursing. "You amateurs! How much longer do we have to wait? I'm losing not only time and money but also my reputation," he yelled. "If you can't handle it, Eagleman, just leave. I'm tired of covering your ass," said one of the scientists, turning and storming out of the lab, slamming the door behind him. Several others in protective suits followed him out. Only one scientist remained, who I understood was Eagleman. He lowered his head and stared at the floor, visibly upset. He muttered something under his breath, and listening closely I heard, "Who's covering for whom? Damn bastard. Losing money? Cut the budget and demand the impossible. Screw you." Then, in a fit of rage, he grabbed a tray of some liquids and forcefully threw it onto the iron table where the monkey's corpse lay. Shouting something loudly again, the scientist left the lab. The video continued for several seconds with nothing happening. I was about to switch to another video when I noticed something move on the iron table where the monkey lay. It slid off and fell to the floor. It's hard to explain what it looked like. Pink and slimy, without skin, something like a brain. I don't know how, but this pink monstrosity moved slowly toward one of the cages where a dog was sitting. The video ended there. In a hurry, I played the third video, also dated January 3rd, 2026. The video showed the same lab, but it was filmed from a different camera. I gathered that several hours had passed since the scientists' conflict, and the room was empty. However, the camera captured something horrifying. The video clearly showed a dog eating something slimy. I realized it was the same cage where the pink slime had crawled. This abomination made unpleasant sounds. Each time the dog bit or chewed it, the pink slime screamed like a monkey. After a while, the dog started whining and then frantically gnawing at the cage. The recording ended there. Chills ran down my spine. Honestly, none of this seemed like a joke. The camera footage looked realistic. If all this was true, what awaited us in the future? I decided I needed to fully investigate this smartphone, watch all the videos, read all the messages, look at all the photos, check the phone numbers. And just as I was about to watch the fourth video, there was a knock on the door. I looked at the surveillance camera and saw my brother Patrick on the porch. "What's up?" I said, opening the door for my brother. "Harry, I've lost all my money," Patrick complained, walking into the house. "Why aren't you at work? Decided to follow in your older brother's footsteps and become unemployed?" He started joking. "I'm not feeling well," I lied. Patrick looked at me with feigned suspicion, then suddenly started yelling loudly, "Mary, how could you let Patrick slack off work? Mary, where are you?" Once again, my brother was being a fool. I had to ask him to be quieter, explaining that my wife had been on duty all night and was now resting. Patrick listened to me, which was rare, and we spent the rest of the time chatting about various nonsense. I didn't want to tell my brother about what had happened to me last night or show him the smartphone. He would blow this situation out of proportion, turn it into a tragedy, a comedy, or worse, genuinely worry about me. In reality, Patrick is very smart. He works for the government. Unfortunately, I don't know what he does there, as he rarely talks about his job, and I don't ask. But I sometimes imagine he has a very important mission. Patrick left in the evening. After seeing him off, I decided to return to studying the smartphone, but I was distracted by Mary. She was in a bad mood because she had lost a patient the day before. After surgery and prolonged therapy, the patient was on the mend, but due to a sudden infection, they quickly passed away. Mary wanted to relax and take a walk, and I couldn't refuse my beloved wife. We went to the nearest pub, had a few drinks, and decided to stroll along the waterfront. It was a bit chilly outside. The spring breeze brushed against my face as I walked, thinking about what I had seen on the smartphone. I told Mary everything and warned her that I wasn't planning to call the police yet. I was too curious to find out what else the phone held. My wife didn't argue with me, only asked me to be more rational and not to take what I saw too much to heart. Returning home, I sat down again to study the smartphone and played the fourth video. I was deeply shocked by what I saw. It started as usual. Scientists in masks and protective suits were conducting experiments on animals. Then one of the scientists noticed that one of the cages with a dog had been gnawed from the inside, and the animal lay motionless. He called his colleague, and they discussed something for a few minutes. Then they opened the cage, took out the dog, and placed it on the same iron table. When one of the scientists attempted to perform an autopsy, the dog's head suddenly fell to the floor. The scientist stepped back as the head started spinning in place. Then, with a horrifying crack, bones began to sprout from the head like tentacles. In an instant, the dog's head turned into a terrifying creature resembling a spider. It began to whine and bark. The scientists clearly hadn't expected this, and for the first few seconds they watched in horror as the animal transformed. Then one of them began to back away toward the door. The spider-like mutant seemed to notice this and lunged at him, barking. It started tearing and gnawing at the scientist's suit. I heard terrible screams. The second scientist grabbed a chair and tried to help his colleague, managing to hit the mutant and throw it against the wall. However, the creature immediately got up and ran out the door. Meanwhile, the injured scientist continued to scream in pain while his colleague called for help. But that was just the beginning. Within a couple of minutes, several more people arrived in the lab. They began to examine the injured scientist, who had already lost consciousness by then. They didn't notice the impending danger. The dog's torso was still on the iron table, and it suddenly began to twitch uncontrollably. Then bones started growing from the torso, too. The scientist who had witnessed this scene a few minutes earlier screamed and ran out of the lab. The others watched in amazement as another mutant transformed. At that moment, the injured scientist, who had been lying on the floor a moment ago, jumped up like an animal and sank his teeth into one of the people. The second person, in shock, backed away, not noticing the mutant creeping up behind him. The camera recording ended there. I turned off the smartphone and couldn't collect myself for some time. It was terrifying and very unpleasant. I started to wonder, could all this be true? It all looked like scenes from horror movies. But what if it does happen? Should I take some measures then? But what should I do? Call the police? Will they believe me? Or should I keep the smartphone, find this laboratory? Wait, what am I thinking? Do I look like a superhero? Can I handle such a task? First, I need to thoroughly examine all the videos on this phone and then take some action. I decided to rest, sleep, and resume watching the videos and photos in the morning. That night, I had heavy dreams. Spider-like mutants, people in protective suits and masks resembling dogs and rats chasing me, a mysterious night guest committing suicide, all of it merged into one continuous nightmare. The next day, I was home alone again. Mary had gone to work and I decided to take another day off. I had an important reason, but I told my boss I still wasn't feeling well. I grabbed my smartphone and... The fifth video was also a camera recording, but this time I realized it was from a portable body camera worn by a lab security guard. He was walking down a dark corridor where a red light flickered intermittently, and the sound of an alarm could be heard, suggesting an emergency had been declared in the building. Over the radio, there were noises, screams, gunshots, and pleas for help. On the walls, I noticed the inscription, "The future is in genetics." The entire corridor was splattered with blood and gore, with bodies scattered here and there. The guard moved slowly, checking for any signs of life among the corpses, his heavy breathing betraying his fear. Suddenly, he heard a loud growl behind him. The guard spun around to see a massive, horrifying creature with giant teeth and claws, resembling an oversized dog. Blood dripped from its fur, and pieces of a protective suit dangled from it. Oh God, this creature had once been a scientist. The guard was stunned and terrified by the monster. He drew his weapon and began firing. The monster dodged the bullets and fled. The guard, wasting no time, ran in the opposite direction. Along the way, he encountered convulsing corpses, wounded people begging for rescue, small, pink, slimy abominations leaping from wall to wall, and spider-like mutants of various sizes. But the guard, frightened by the scene, kept running without stopping. After a while, he reached a large, well-lit room where several other people were barricading the doors, A scientist with a badge that read Eckelman was giving orders. The guard approached him and reported what he had seen. Eckelman asked about the doors leading outside. The guard replied that they were blocked and the control panel was on fire. Eckelman started cursing loudly, convinced that someone had done this deliberately, trapped them with these monsters. They were in a trap and had no idea how to get out. Time passed, and outside the door, screams, sobs, growls, and other vile sounds could be heard. People began to panic, realizing they were left alone with the monsters. Some scientists started proposing ways to escape: ventilation shafts, breaking through the ceiling, or descending into the basement. All these suggestions seemed absurd, but it was clear that people were desperate. Suddenly, one of the walls collapsed, filling the room with dust and debris, and through the enormous hole in the wall, monsters poured in. The recording ended there. I took a sip of coffee and began looking at the photographs. They were truly horrifying. In one of the photographs, I saw a half-human, half-rat creature, its body decomposing. In another, two people fused together at the bones like Siamese twins. One had no head, replaced by something resembling an enormous brain covered in an inexplicable rash and slime. The other was missing a lower jaw and eyes. It looked grotesque. The third photograph showed the same creature with giant teeth and claws resembling a dog. The picture was labeled Patient Zero. The fourth was the most horrifying. It depicted a large room with a massive slime in the center, more precisely, a mash of various human bodies fused together into a single terrifying organism. Some bodies had no skin, exposing a mesh of muscles and bones. Others had their internal organs spilling out. At the very top of this ghastly heap of bodies was a giant eye. I realized it was the same room where the remaining scientists and the guard had taken refuge. They hadn't managed to escape, unlike the monsters. The final photograph showed a massive hole in the building, which I understood to be the laboratory. All these mutants, slimes, werewolves, and other inexplicable creatures had broken free. This world was doomed. I put the phone down and began to ponder life. Had humanity made a fatal mistake? Had we sinned? And now is God punishing us? I wasn't a believer. I didn't go to church. But at that moment I began to pray. I realized humanity had opened the gates of hell with its experiments, allowing demons to enter our world. And now every person, regardless of their actions or whether they were truly a sinner, faced inevitable punishment. Could this be called divine retribution? Or perhaps God was trying to warn us. Is that why this smartphone ended up in my hands? But why me? No, that's a foolish question. I needed to act, to save Mary, Patrick, everyone. I had to warn them about what awaited us in 2026. But what to do? The first thought that came to mind was to contact my brother. I took my phone and started searching for Patrick's contact. Just then, the door opened and Mary walked in. She looked at me strangely. I hadn't expected her home so early, so I was slightly surprised. I asked her what was wrong. Mary said she came to talk to me. We settled in the living room. My wife was silent and I was impatient because no matter how absurd it sounded, I needed to save the world. So I urged her to speak. She took a deep breath and began. "Harry, I was on a date," Mary said. "What? What date?" I didn't understand. "It's Patrick, your brother. I wasn't on a night shift, I was with him," Mary said. Her sudden revelation caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say in response. Mary continued, "This isn't the first time, Harry. I've been with him before, you see. We've been seeing each other for about 6 months. I know I've behaved terribly, but recently I realized I couldn't keep it a secret any longer. And it's all been a huge mistake, you understand? That's why I left that day. Believe me, it was our last meeting with Patrick. Mary finished. I thought back to yesterday when my brother came by. He wanted to talk to her and didn't expect to see me. I didn't know how to describe my feelings at that moment. I was devastated. My brother and my wife. Why did they do this? Didn't they have enough of my love? My chest hurt. I felt nauseous, and I was deeply hurt. I just stood up and walked out of the room. I didn't want to see Mary cry. I didn't want to see anyone. At that moment, I only thought my world had collapsed and now I was alone. I walked down the street not knowing what to do next. I wanted to drink and forget everything. So I went into the nearest pub, the very one where Mary and I had hung out last night. I asked the bartender for a strong drink and sat at a free table. For a while, I just stared into space, replaying Mary's words over and over in my mind. It was hard to believe, but why? Why did they do it? I wanted to cry, but held back with all my strength. At some point, I noticed a man. A tall, slightly overweight, middle-aged man was sitting at the neighboring table, loudly talking on the phone. He was certainly noisy, but the topic of his conversation caught my attention. He was loudly complaining and saying, "Yes, I understand, but that damn Eckelman is at it again. I told him to think about the shareholders, but he doesn't want to listen. You need to talk to him yourself." "Yes, I understand." "Okay, I'll keep going." The man noisily placed the phone on the table, then drank his beer and left the pub. I hurried after him. His gait, his behavior. I wasn't sure, but he resembled one of the scientists. Could it be the very beast, Patient Zero? He walked to a bus stop and got on a bus. I followed him. We rode a few blocks. He got off in the business district and headed to one of the high-rise buildings. I followed him, but in the lobby, security stopped me. Entry was by pass or invitation only. I had to leave and wait outside. I stood there for nearly 3 hours when I noticed him near the parking lot. He wasn't alone. He was with a man in a business suit. However, I couldn't see him clearly from behind the column, so I had to get closer. And when I saw the scientist's companion, I couldn't believe my eyes. Standing next to him was my brother Patrick. He was serious and arguing rather harshly with the scientist. What could this mean? Was everything I saw on the smartphone just a joke by my brother? No, wait, what is this? My brother suddenly grabbed the scientist and slammed him against the wall. He started shouting his threats, and I listened closely. This isn't a game of espionage. What you guys are up to is illegal, Patrick said. I'm not going to wait for a court ruling or anything else. You can just be eliminated. You need to understand that. Enough wasting time. Finishing his tirade, Patrick abruptly released the scientist, turned and walked away. The man stood there, muttering something under his breath before pulling out a cigarette and lighting it. It dawned on me. All of this was true. It wasn't a joke. The scientists, the videos, the photos, the monsters, the mutants, the blood and death, everything I had seen was real. My head spun from the realization that the smartphone truly held horrific events that could happen in the near future. Of course I had understood this, but deep down, I still had hope. Somewhere in the depths of my soul I hoped, believed, that everything would turn out fine. However, reality was cruel. My wife had cheated on me. In the near future, monsters and mutants would escape from an unknown laboratory, and my brother was somehow involved in all of it. Patrick, tell me, why do I deserve all this? I asked myself mentally. While I was thinking about my fate, the scientist made a phone call and then headed to the bus stop again. This time, I didn't follow him. I decided to go home. Too many events had happened in the last day, and I needed to think it all over and talk to Mary to put an end to the situation. I stood on the porch for a long time, hesitating to go inside. I thought, this is my home. Behind this door is the living room where Mary and I often sat together, the dining room where we shared meals, the bedroom where we had so much love. I was happy, but now, could I open the door and pretend I could forget all of this? To forgive would be to betray all those memories, the love we had shared. Could I forgive her? Without coming to a concrete conclusion, I finally decided to go inside. I opened the door, walked through the rooms, but found no one. Mary had left and left a note. The letter contained many words, but in short, she was asking for forgiveness and professing her love. While I was thinking she would stay with her mother. Cowardly traitor. She decided to shift the burden of solving this problem onto me. Why didn't she stay home? Why didn't she beg me to forgive her? Why didn't she fight for our love? Why did she run away? I couldn't bear it any longer. I started to cry. Never in my life had I felt so hurt and pained. I don't remember at what point, but I fell asleep. In the morning, a knock on the door woke me up. I struggled to get up. My head ached terribly because I had drunk heavily the night before. Moving with difficulty, I opened the door, and of course it was Patrick. Apparently, he thought I was at work and came to talk to Mary. But here I was opening the door again. My brother stood on the porch, smiling at me. Damn fool. At that moment, I wanted to punch him in the face, but I restrained myself. It was difficult, but I decided to talk to my brother first and then get into a fight. Patrick walked into the living room, suspecting nothing, apparently unaware that Mary hadn't told him. But my brother immediately noticed my bad mood. "Did you get into an accident? What's with the look, Harry?" Patrick started. "Did something happen? You can tell me," he continued. I looked at him with undisguised hatred and sadness. Patrick noticed my gaze. He had always been good at reading people and understanding what they were thinking. He probably suspected that I knew something about him and Mary. But first, I decided to find out his involvement with the secret laboratory. "It's a long story, easier to show," I began. "Listen, Patrick, I'm going to show you a smartphone. Take it seriously, this isn't a joke. I think you'll understand what it's about." With these words, I took out the smartphone and handed it to my brother. "Oh, this is a new model. Did you decide to give me a gift, Harry?" Patrick started joking, but I interrupted him. "Patrick, this isn't a joke. Watch the videos, look at the photos and messages. Take your time, you've got all the time you need." I decided to make myself something to eat while my brother went through the contents of the smartphone. A couple of hours later, Patrick walked into the dining room. He sat down across from me and placed the smartphone between us. My brother was grim, stunned, silent, and looked at me questioningly. "Can I know where you got this smartphone?" Patrick asked me. "Of course, I'll answer all your questions, but first I'd like to ask you something," I replied. My brother nodded silently. "I want to know if you have any connection to this laboratory," I asked. "Why do you think that?" Patrick answered with a question. "I saw you with one of the lab workers," I said shortly. "Well then, so you know a lot? Didn't expect that from you, Harry." All right, I owe you an explanation," Patrick continued. "First of all, you need to understand, I work for the government. I can't say which department, but to put it briefly, my area of responsibility is the activities of large corporate companies. This laboratory was under investigation, and I was tasked with finding out certain details. Patrick didn't seem like himself as he told me all this. For the first time in my life, I saw this side of my brother. Had I been so blind all these years? Or had Patrick been hiding his true self skillfully? You see, Harry, large companies always cooperate with the government, but they have their own secrets. We need to know how harmful these secrets are and whether they can be beneficial. Honestly, Harry, you could say you helped me by giving me this smartphone. That idiot from the lab was trying to play cat and mouse with us, posing as a double agent, a spy, but he was useless. However, now there's a lot I don't understand, and I'd like some answers too. Patrick finished his monologue. I had imagined many things, but I never expected my brother to be some kind of secret agent or government spy. And worst of all, I had lived in complete ignorance all these years, not understanding what was happening around me. I had been truly blind, and importantly, I hadn't paid attention to my loved ones. Perhaps seeing my detachment and coldness, Mary decided to cheat on me. I looked at Patrick again. Here he was, my brother. We grew up together, played together, sometimes argued. But he was always there, sharing toys, helping with schoolwork. He was strong, did well in school, won in sports, and was loved by girls. I was proud of him. I loved him. And now, in my dining room, sat a stranger. I wouldn't have recognized this Patrick. He was a stranger. All this time, he silently waited for me to answer his question. Patrick wasn't rushing me. I gathered my thoughts and told him, "A homeless man brought me this smartphone at night when I was home alone." And I told Patrick what had happened to me, what I had seen, and what I thought about it. It was clear that my brother didn't expect such an answer. Perhaps he still didn't understand the situation we were in. But I kept talking, trying to convince him to take action. He worked for the government, and if they stopped the research, nothing would happen, and the world would be saved. I told him we couldn't delay. However, Patrick was skeptical of my words. "I want to believe you, Harry, but all this sounds fantastical. Do you understand? I did see all those photos and videos. They're very creepy. But it could be photomontage or CGI," Patrick said. "You need to check the laboratory, Patrick. Stop them," I interrupted my brother. "It's not as simple as you think, Harry. My powers are limited. You can't just barge into a private lab. You have to understand that," my brother tried to convince me. "No, you don't understand, Patrick. This will happen if we don't stop them. Everything you saw on the smartphone will happen. Believe me, Patrick. I feel it. If you don't want to do it, just tell me where the laboratory is," I continued to insist. "Harry, first of all, I can't let you break the law. Second, I'll be honest, we don't know where this damned lab is. They've carefully hidden this information. Third, I promise to look into it. I'll definitely find this lab, and believe me, you don't need to worry about everything you saw," my brother tried to reassure me. However, his words only made me angrier. He thinks I'm some kind of paranoid fool, making a mockery of me. I was consumed with rage and I couldn't hold back. I started yelling at him. "Believe you, Patrick? Believe the man who's sleeping with my wife? A traitor who spat on his own brother's feelings? Did you have fun, Patrick? Did you tell jokes to my wife? Did you lie in bed and laugh at me? How can I trust someone like you? Answer me, brother. Do you even understand what you've done? You destroyed my marriage," I said, letting out everything I thought about him. I saw that Patrick wasn't surprised or shocked by my words. He looked at me with pain in his eyes. Tears ran down his cheek, but I didn't care. I was furious. I wanted to tear him apart, smash his face in. However, I restrained myself once again. To be honest, these emotional swings had exhausted me. I was very tired and didn't want to prove anything to anyone, so I just got up and opened the front door. Patrick understood everything. He took the mysterious smartphone and silently left the house. I locked the door behind him and went to take a shower. 3 days later, Mary called me. She wanted to meet. I invited her home. She came in the afternoon and we talked late into the night. The next morning, Mary packed her things and left. I couldn't forgive her. Just like my brother, we no longer talked or met. A month or two later, I received the divorce papers. Now I was single. It was very hard, and I decided to bury myself in work. Time flew by, and before I knew it, winter had come. One day, returning home, I saw a banner advertising the launch of a new smartphone model, the very same one Patrick had taken. I remembered everything and was gripped by fear again. I thought I should call my brother and ask him about the lab. Had he found it? What happened to the scientists? What did the government decide? And what measures did Patrick take? I dialed my brother's number several times, but each time I couldn't press the call button. Even after several months, pride and resentment wouldn't let me, and I was still angry at them. In the end, I decided not to call Patrick. I chose to trust him. Even if he was skeptical of my words, I hoped he had listened to me. I believed that my brother would figure out the situation and that maybe the lab was already shut down. I was very wrong. Everything happened faster than I could have imagined. At first, there were news reports. A clean-shaven anchor in a fancy suit talked about the dangers of a new virus. What's the big deal? I thought. Viruses appear almost every year or even every day, and people tend to get sick in winter. Then the news became more alarming, reporting hundreds, thousands, then millions of cases. Suddenly, the government declared a global crisis. Lockdowns were imposed worldwide. A representative from the World Health Organization gave speeches almost every day. After a while, Mary called me. She was scared. She said patients infected with the virus were going crazy. Some attacked doctors, some died. And now she was afraid to go to work. I tried to reassure her, but I knew the situation was irreversible. Then the government declared martial law. Riots, looting, and chaos broke out across the country. There were numerous videos online of infected people attacking others. The situation in the world was rapidly deteriorating. I didn't know what to do and effectively barricaded myself at home. This was the only genius idea that came to mind. One day, Patrick called me. He said he would come soon and help me. Honestly, when it all started, I was even angrier at my brother. I had shown and told him everything. He did nothing. He allowed this virus to emerge, or so I thought. But as time passed and the world continued to go mad, I thought more often about my brother and Mary. I was relieved when Patrick called me. He arrived late at night in a military vehicle. Patrick was dressed in a military officer's uniform, and I hadn't known he had such a high rank. My brother kept surprising me. Patrick explained that it wasn't safe in the city and we needed to leave immediately. He took me to a farm on an island. It took us almost 3 days to get there, first by car, then by a small military boat. On the way, he told me what had happened. According to him, the top government officials reacted extremely negatively and dismissively to the information from the smartphone. They effectively banned any actions against the scientists in the laboratory. Patrick found out that lobbyists for this large private company were working within the government, and because of them, all information about the laboratory was being blocked, including its location. Eventually, he found the building where these experiments were conducted. But it was already too late. Monsters and mutants had escaped. The army managed to destroy many of the horrific creatures, but their burned and decaying bodies began to release a dangerous virus that infected the soldiers. By the time they realized it, it was too late. The catastrophe could not be stopped. Of course, Patrick apologized for not believing me and deeply regretted what had happened between him and Mary. However, at that moment, his primary goal was to save us. So on the farm, I found my ex-wife. Mary was very happy to see me. She took me to a house and explained that there were other people on the farm, relatives of high-ranking military officers and officials, politicians' children, celebrities, and even some billionaires. She said this was a secure place where we could wait out the storm. Patrick left immediately, as he had other matters to attend to. I stayed with Mary. The first days on the island were calm. We regularly received news about what was happening on the mainland. We had food, and the military ensured we maintained order on the farm. I began seeing Mary again. This whole situation made me reconsider our relationship, and I eventually forgave her. There was no news from Patrick, but as always, I believed he was alive and on a very important mission. Everything happened suddenly. I don't know how, perhaps through the food they brought us or through infected soldiers. But the plague reached the island. First, one person got sick, then the second, the third, and so on. The virus spread at a mad pace. We stocked up on water and food and barricaded ourselves in the house. With us was another soldier named Henry, a young, cheerful, and resilient guy. Mary, Henry, and I stayed in the house for a long time, taking turns on night watch. Sometimes we ventured outside for supplies. We were scared, but we hoped that someone from the mainland would come and rescue us. Henry was the first to get infected. He suffered from excruciating pain and eventually took his weapon and shot himself. I dragged his body outside, far from the house. Then it was Mary's turn. She tried to kill herself with a kitchen knife. I tried to stop her. I didn't want to lose my beloved. But in the end, she turned into a horrible mutant and nearly ate me. Patrick saved me again. He burst into the house and simply shot what was left of Mary. I was heartbroken. I had lost my wife once more. Patrick took me off the island. There was no one left alive on the farm except for me. Everyone had either died at the hands of monsters or turned into those terrifying creatures. Patrick had changed a lot. He was gaunt, and it was clear he wasn't taking care of himself. Now I recognized him. As crazy as it sounds, the man who had been banging on my door late at night months ago, the man who had left me that strange smartphone, was my brother Patrick. Somehow, the current Patrick had traveled back in time to warn me of the danger. I was shocked when I realized this, and immediately told him my theory. Patrick remained silent and just smiled at me. A little later, he said it was entirely possible. On the way, my brother explained that the virus was difficult to trace. According to the scientists, the virus was somewhat intelligent and could adapt to its environment, even choosing its target. Moreover, it manifested differently in each infected person. Some went mad, some turned into monsters, and others suffered intense pain. There was no way to predict how the virus would behave. Forecasts, analyses, all previously taken measures were useless, and the scientists couldn't find a cure. But they did have a plan, and that's what Patrick wanted to show me. We arrived at a secure underground laboratory. Patrick led me through all the security checkpoints, and we descended into the main hall. There were many different people: military personnel, politicians, officials, and scientists. Among them, I saw a familiar face. It was Eckelman, the scientist from the lab, the very one who started this whole process, whose research led to the catastrophe. That bastard survived and was working on something important with the others. A wave of intense anger washed over me. I knew he was to blame for everything. Without realizing it, I moved toward him. Then I grabbed him and started hitting him. People tried to pull me away, but I clung to Eckelman like a madman, shouting something. They would have shot me, thinking I was infected, if Patrick hadn't arrived. He managed to calm me down and pull me away. He led me to a small room and asked me to stay there while he dealt with the problems I had caused him. I noticed that I was holding something hard. When I looked, I saw the smartphone, the very same with 2 screens, ultra thin, the new model. I must have grabbed it during the fight. Could it be Eckelman's phone? I knew what to do with it. The next day, Patrick came to check on me. He said he was part of an important mission. "Harry, they're sending me back in time, but not for long," he began. "It's hard to explain. We can't stay in another time permanently, or so these people in white coats say. So we'll be pulled back to our timeline. I won't be alone. There are several of us, and our task is to prevent the spread of the virus," Patrick said. He paused for a few minutes and then spoke again, more quietly and sadly. "If I had listened to you back then and done everything possible, I regret everything. Forgive me, Harry. But now I have a chance to make things right. I hope to see you again, brother." When he was about to leave, I stopped Patrick and handed him the smartphone. My brother looked at me in surprise. Then he smiled and left the room.
Story 4.
Alfred Hitchcock once said that there is nothing scarier than a closed door, and it's all because there lies the unknown. And what could be scarier than the unknown? Only the fear itself. James Brown was driving his car down a country road and cursing terribly. His car kept getting stuck in the mud and the engine kept stalling. "Damn Aunt Claire!" James growled. "Why did she have to live so far out in the middle of nowhere?" The thing was, Aunt Claire was a distant relative of James, and upon her death, she had left her house to him. Now James was on his way to see the inherited property. It turned out that Aunt Claire had lived in a provincial, musty American village. James didn't expect to find a luxurious mansion in such a place, but he hoped to sell the unexpected property for a good price. Parking his car on the side of the road, James got out and walked along the path that led to the house. The house did indeed turn out to be a second-rate shack. The porch was broken, the living room was moldy from dampness, and the second floor consisted of just one room. "Well, yeah," James chuckled. "Why would Aunt Claire need a big house?" The kitchen clearly did not meet hygiene standards. Rotting wood, a dirty sink, and... "Oh, damn! There are cockroaches everywhere, hundreds of them! Gross!" James dashed out of the kitchen, overwhelmed by a wave of nausea. On a rickety shelf, he saw a chemical insecticide. Grabbing it, he started spraying the entire kitchen. Cockroaches, bedbugs, and spiders scattered in all directions. "That's right, bastards, that's right!" James shouted with malicious glee. After dealing with the insects, James threw open a window to air out the smell. A cold autumn wind burst into the kitchen, scattering dust and debris, rustling the pages of a book lying on the kitchen table. James shut the window and picked up the book. It turned out to be a notebook filled with various children's drawings. Under each drawing, in an adult's hand, were dates: October 30th, 1933, April 13th, 1935. James tossed the notebook aside and went to the living room. From there, he climbed upstairs. The furnishings were strikingly shabby. A sagging bed, a nightstand, a wardrobe against the wall, and a large, murky mirror. James was about to leave when he noticed a door in the wall, cleverly disguised as part of the room's paneling. He approached it and tried to open it, but it was locked. James knocked on it with his knuckles. It was metal. All right, there must be a key somewhere. He went downstairs and began rummaging through the drawers of the writing desk. There was a pile of papers, rusty clips, some powder in a bottle, and a lot of junk, but no key. James waved it off and plopped down on the sagging couch. It was getting late, and he felt sleepy. I'll spend the night here, and in the morning I'll go to town and sell this lousy house to hell," James mumbled, falling asleep. During the night, Brown woke up to the sound of a child crying. He sat up and shook his head in confusion. "There are no children here," he muttered groggily. "Maybe at the neighbors." But the crying was distinctly coming from inside the house. James wandered through the house, searching for the source of the noise. The crying was coming from upstairs. Nervously twitching at the sound, he climbed the stairs. He immediately turned on the light, but there was no one in the room. Then James realized that the crying was coming from behind the door. Fearfully, he rushed to it and shouted, "Quiet, quiet, buddy, I'll save you now." James started banging and yanking on the door, but it wouldn't budge. In a panic, he began frantically searching the room for something to help open it. But nothing was at hand, and the child's crying grew fainter and fainter until it finally stopped. James collapsed on the floor next to the door, gasping for breath. He couldn't understand how there could be a child in an abandoned house, and behind a locked door at that. Soon exhaustion mingled with sleep, and Brown fell asleep right on the floor by the door. In the morning, James immediately rushed to the neighbors for help since he couldn't open the door. The neighbor's house was beautiful and cozy looking. An elderly man opened the door to his knock. "Hello, I'm your new neighbor. My name is James," he introduced himself. "I live in the house on the right." "Hello, I'm Matt," the neighbor replied. The man had a very pleasant, deep voice. He spoke with a friendly smile. "You see, I have a very strange request," James said. "What is it?" Matt asked in surprise. "There's a door in my house and I can't open it. Can you help me?" "Sure, but what's so strange about that?" "You see," Brown lowered his voice, "I think there's someone behind the door." "Why do you think that?" "Last night I heard a child crying, and it was coming from behind the door." The man suddenly changed his expression and invited James into the house. After seating the guest on a soft couch, Matt asked how James had come to own the house. "My distant relative, Aunt Claire, died and left the house to me in her will." "Do you know how she died?" "Not exactly. I think her heart gave out. She was old. She died of fright." "What?" "Yeah, she kept talking about some door and a child crying and many other things. We thought she was crazy. In the end, she was found dead on the floor of her own house with a heart attack and a look of terror on her face. Believe me, we searched the entire house and there was no door. I advise you to leave this house before you meet the same fate as your aunt." James felt as if he had been doused with cold water. He struggled to comprehend reality after Matt's words. Absent-mindedly saying goodbye, he left the neighbor's house. Returning to his own, he went upstairs first thing. The door was there. James approached it and touched it. Everything was very tangible. He tried to open it again, but to no avail. Then he remembered the axe in his car. Grabbing the axe, he rushed upstairs. There he lunged at the door and struck it with all his might. The axe handle broke in half, and the blade nearly fell on James's foot. Jumping aside and cursing, he trudged downstairs to think of what else he could do with the door. James spent almost the entire day trying to open it. The drill bits broke. Hammers and saws bounced off and dulled. James had ideas about using acid and even dynamite, but he had no means to carry them out. "What should I do?" he whispered wearily, sinking onto the bed. "How do I open this damn door? If I don't find out what's behind it, I'll go crazy from curiosity." Only in the evening did James feel ravenous hunger. He had no food in the house or with him. He managed to find a small store and bought something to eat. He had to buy ready-made products and eat them immediately since cooking in the kitchen was impossible, and there were mice in the house. After eating, James went to bed with a firm intention to open the door tomorrow. During the night, James woke up from the heat in the house. "Why is it so hot in here?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. When he woke up, he screamed in fear. The whole room was engulfed in flames, and behind the door the child started crying again. But this time he was screaming, "Mommy, Mommy, save me, save me, now, now!" James mumbled. He darted around the room, not knowing what to do, and the fire grew stronger and stronger. It had already cut James off from the exit and the window. James was pinned against the cursed door. The child behind it kept crying and wailing. James decided it was over and closed his eyes so he wouldn't see his death. But at the moment when the flames were already licking his cheeks, and the child was screaming like he was being slaughtered, everything suddenly went silent and became as cold as it had been. James cautiously opened his eyes. There was no fire, everything was quiet, and no one was crying behind the door. "I'm going crazy," James muttered, grabbing his head and collapsing in exhaustion on the bed. He slept without any incidents until morning. When he woke up, he ran back to the neighbors. "Hello, it's me again," James said to Matt, who opened the door. "Oh, it's you," Matt sighed heavily. "Did something happen again?" "Yes, I want you to come to the house and tell me if there is a door or not." "All right," Matt said resignedly. "Let's go." James and Matt went into the house and climbed to the second floor. "Here's the door," James said. Matt approached the spot and touched it. He ran his fingers along the seam between the door and the wall, but his face showed that he didn't feel any difference. "I'm afraid there's nothing here," Matt sighed. "Really? You don't see or feel anything," James exclaimed. "I've already told you, and I'll say it again. Leave this place as soon as possible. Maybe there's something wrong here, so why do you need this? Sell the house and leave." James absent-mindedly thanked Matt and saw him to the door. Closing the door behind him, James slumped onto the couch. "Maybe Matt is laughing at me or I'm going insane," he thought. From exhaustion, James fell into a deep sleep. When he woke up, it was already dusk outside. "No, I won't spend another night here. I need to leave." With these words, he left the house, locked it with the key, and drove to town. The town where James stayed was barely bigger than a village, but it had a hotel where he intended to spend the night. On the way to the hotel, James saw a local library. There must be something about this damn house in there. They should have the internet. James checked into the hotel. After booking a room, he asked the receptionist if there was anything in the local library about a house in the village. "Which house are you talking about, sir?" the receptionist asked. "The house on 8th Street. House number 5. The receptionist's face suddenly changed sharply. His eyes narrowed, his palms sweated, and his whole demeanor became nervous. "Sir, why do you need to know something about that house?" "Because it's now my house." "Sir, for God's sake, leave that house and never come back, and forget the way there." "Damn it!" James snapped. "You're the second person advising me to leave but not explaining why I should do it." "I'll tell you everything, sir, just don't get so upset. The thing is, this is a very old house. It was built back in the 1920s. The first residents were a young family named Corsten. They weren't locals, but after getting married, they moved here. Mr. Corsten was an excellent carpenter and built the house himself. They weren't very wealthy, so the house wasn't very big, but he made 2 rooms on the second floor. One large one, the bedroom, and a small one intended for a nursery. At that time, they didn't have children, but they planned to. However, time passed, and they still had no children. Upset, Mrs. Corsten ordered her husband to board up the door to the nursery to avoid tormenting herself. He did as she asked. But as soon as he did, his wife got pregnant. Of course, they were both delighted, opened the door, and started preparing for the baby's arrival. Everything was going well, but in the last months of pregnancy, there was a fire in the house. Unfortunately, Mr. Corsten wasn't home, and his wife inhaled a lot of smoke and lost consciousness. It's unknown how it would have ended, but Corsten arrived in time and saved his wife. He took her to the hospital. But remember, this was the early 1930s, and medicine wasn't what it is today. The doctors worked on her for a long time, and there was a serious risk of miscarriage. During this time, Corsten was beside himself. He left the hospital and started walking around it. Then some old woman approached him. She told him that the fire was no accident because they had built their house on a bad spot. She didn't say what was wrong with the spot, only that his wife would lose the baby and would never be able to have another. Corsten nearly went mad. He started pulling his hair out and begging the old woman to help him. The old woman agreed, but said that her help wouldn't last forever, and that sooner or later something bad would happen anyway. This child wouldn't live long, but Corsten didn't hear her words anymore. He was happy that she was going to help. He rushed to the hospital and was told that his wife and baby were fine. Corsten was overjoyed and forgot all about the old woman. Soon his wife gave birth to a boy. They were both happy, and Corsten never thought about the old woman again. But when the boy turned 5, he disappeared. The parents searched for him, but never found him. Mrs. Corsten gradually went mad with grief, and Mr. Corsten started drinking heavily. They boarded up the nursery door again to avoid reopening their emotional wounds. Later, they ended up in different clinics. The wife went to a psychiatric hospital and the husband to a rehab center. The house became state property, and then your aunt bought it. I heard from her neighbors that she often talked about the cries and wails of a little boy and the closed door. But no one ever saw any children or doors. Everyone thought she was a bit crazy. But she didn't bother anyone, so everyone stayed quiet. And then you probably know the rest yourself. James scratched his head. Yeah, quite a story. How do you know about it? The receptionist narrowed his eyes and whispered, In small towns, everyone knows everything. The night at the hotel passed peacefully, and in the morning, James went to the library to find out why the house was built on a bad spot. The librarian was reluctant to give James anything, but he insisted. All right, I'll give you some newspaper clippings from those days. The woman relented, but don't come back with any complaints. No problem. James took newspapers from the 1920s to 1940s and sat down to read. At first, he found nothing interesting, but then he came across a note from October 24th, 1919. It stated that the town's mayor, who was also the head of the village, wanted to sell some land, but the residents were against it because the mayor intended to sell land from an old cemetery. However, the mayor was adamant, arguing that the cemetery was very old, and there were no living relatives of those buried there, and the dead had long since turned to dust. He also said that the village needed new places for houses, and he wasn't superstitious. There were later notes that the mayor sold the land for construction, but people were unhappy about it. Then there were notes that newcomers bought the land for building. But the most interesting article James found was in a newspaper from May 15th, 1921. It stated that a young couple named Corsten came to the village. They decided to buy land on the worst part of the cemetery where suicides were buried. The village elders advised them against buying that plot, but the Corstens didn't listen. Later, the press reveled in what happened to the Corstons, saying it was all the mayor's fault for selling cemetery land. James found nothing else of interest and thanked the librarian, returning all the materials. On the way back, James was deep in thought. He had heard that places where suicides are buried in cemeteries are considered the worst, and they are even made outside the cemetery's fence. But he never imagined it was true and not just superstition. I absolutely have to find out the secret of this door, or I simply won't be able to sleep peacefully. The first thing James did when he returned home was to search the entire house for any records from that time. He started with the writing desk, but it contained only papers belonging to Aunt Claire, which were of no interest to James. They included recipes, gardening tips, Christmas cards, and similar items. James checked for hidden compartments, double walls, and so on, but found nothing of the sort. Next, he examined the shelf, but suddenly remembered that there was a notebook with children's drawings in the kitchen that seemed to be from that time. James went to the kitchen and found the notebook. At first, it contained simple drawings of rabbits, cats, people, and other typical children's drawings in cheerful, bright colors. But then drawings of a strange figure started to appear. These drawings were made with black or gray pencils, and the dates were from 1936. James remembered that this was the year the Corston boy disappeared. The figure was an indistinct silhouette, like the kind used to depict ghosts. The last drawing was dated October 28, 1936. After that, there was nothing more. These drawings made James uneasy. He set the notebook aside and looked out the window. It was already getting dark. James checked his watch and almost in horror realized that today was October 27, 2006. Which meant that tomorrow would be exactly 70 years since the Corston boy disappeared. James began to shake. No, he couldn't spend the night in this house. James rushed outside and ran to his car. But no matter how hard he tried, the engine wouldn't start. "Damn it!" James roared, jumping out of the car and running down the street without knowing where to go. But where could he run, being several hundred kilometers from his hometown? Very soon, he was out of breath and turned back towards the house. By the time he reached it, it was completely dark. Sighing heavily, James pushed the door open and went inside. The house greeted him with darkness and oppressive silence. Without knowing why, James went upstairs. There, he approached the cursed door and slammed his fist against it. The door responded with a dull sound. "Damn door!" James roared. "I will uncover your secret even if it costs me my life." There was no sleep. James sat on the floor, his back against the door, staring into the time-fog mirror opposite. A dim light bulb hung from the ceiling, and James saw everything in minute detail. Suddenly the light flickered and went out. James jumped to his feet. "What the—" James didn't finish his sentence, as he saw the image in the mirror begin to change. The room remained the same, but everything in it was different. The furniture was new and fresh. James moved closer to the mirror to see what was happening. He himself was not reflected in the mirror, but other people appeared. On the bed opposite the mirror sat a woman about 35 years old. She had her head in her hands, her fingers tangled in her hair. Then the door leading to the first-floor stairs opened and a man entered. The woman raised her head at the noise and screamed when she saw the stranger. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" she demanded. "Don't be afraid of me," the man reassured her. "I mean you no harm. On the contrary, I want to help you. I know about your problem. I know you want a child but can't conceive. I can help you." "What are you implying?" the woman asked indignantly. "I have a husband and he..." The man interrupted her. "Please listen to me. Your house is built on land where suicides were once buried. Later, this cemetery was abandoned, and no one was buried there anymore. That's why the mayor decided to sell the land for new houses." "I didn't know," the woman whispered. "Don't interrupt. Before the mayor's decision, something happened in my family. I had a son, a little boy whom I raised alone because his mother died during childbirth. I had to work a lot to provide for us. I loved my son dearly. He was everything to me," the man sighed heavily. "One day, I was working in the garden, growing vegetables to sell, and my son was playing in the house. He was only 5 years old. I had no one to leave him with, so he was unsupervised. Then I heard a gunshot from the house. Dropping everything, I ran inside and saw—" The man's voice broke and he began to cry, but quickly regained his composure and continued. "I saw that my boy had been playing with a gun. It was loaded and he shot himself. I almost went insane at that moment. I didn't know what to do. Running around the house, wanting to get a doctor, but then I realized it was too late. It dawned on me that I would be imprisoned for negligence, for leaving a gun where a child could reach it. I panicked again. I didn't want to go to prison. Then I had a revelation. I decided to bury my boy in the old cemetery to avoid witnesses. I did so. At night, when everyone was asleep, I took his lifeless body to the cemetery and buried it myself. Then I reported to the police that my son was missing. The police searched but found nothing and dropped the case. Later, the mayor ordered the land to be sold. I was very nervous about it. Plus, I missed my son terribly. One night, coming home from work, I met an old woman. She immediately told me she knew about my grief and how to help. "Your son will be reborn to new parents, but he will be an exact copy," she said. "Wait until a new house is built where you buried your son. Then wait until their despair matches yours, and then go to them and do as I tell you." That's what the old woman told me. And she also told me how to ensure you have a child. But without your consent, I can't do anything. "If you know for sure how to make me pregnant, then tell me," the woman declared without hesitation. "All right, you asked for it," the man replied. All this time, James had been watching the scene in the mirror as if it were a movie. He was glued to the mirror, feeling that he was about to see the entire secret unfold. Meanwhile, the images in the mirror began to change. James saw that the woman and the man were now standing outside with the man holding a shovel. "I remember exactly that we need to dig here," the man said, pointing to a spot. "Well, dig then," the woman said nervously. The man thrust the shovel into the ground near the house's foundation and began to dig. James swallowed hard, guessing what they intended to do. The man had finished digging and descended into the hole. A moment later, he surfaced, holding a small wooden box, darkened with age. The woman helped him lift the box out and climb out himself. The man bent over the box and was about to open it. "Are we really doing this?" the woman muttered. "You agreed already, there's no turning back now," the man noted and opened the lid of the box. The woman involuntarily stepped back. Even James shuddered at the sight. At the bottom of the box lay the partially decomposed body of a small boy. Mostly there were just bones, but here and there was still some blackened flesh, crawling with large white maggots. "Oh, that's disgusting." The woman couldn't hold back. "I feel sick." "Do you want a son or not?" the man snapped angrily. "Yes, but—" the woman hesitated. "Then let's get to it." The man grabbed the box with his son's body and headed for the house. The woman followed. James was practically glued to the mirror, but it suddenly began to fog, the images blurring and disappearing. "Hey, wait!" James shouted, but the image had already vanished, leaving him staring at his reflection and the room's reflection. A second later, the light bulb above his head came back on just as it had been before. Damn it! James nearly hit the mirror with his fist, but caught himself in time. There was no point in breaking it. It might still come in handy. James moved away from the mirror and sat on the bed, needing to think everything through. What kind of ritual did they perform over the poor boy's bones? What did they do that caused Mrs. Corsten to become pregnant? There were no answers to these questions, but they might be the key to solving the mystery. James decided to organize the events in his head. There was an old cemetery where suicides were buried, and a man had buried his deceased young son there. Then the Corstens built their house on this spot. The wife couldn't get pregnant for a long time, and then this man came and performed that diabolical ritual taught to him by an old woman. Later, just before giving birth, the woman nearly died in a fire and almost lost the baby. But again, the old woman helped save the baby, although she said the child wouldn't live long. 5 years later, the boy vanished without a trace, driving the parents insane, and they eventually died in clinics. Not a cheerful picture. James smirked. And all of this was somehow connected to the damn door that only he and his poor aunt could see. Aunt Claire, what a place you chose to buy a haunted house, he thought. James didn't know what to do. It was already past 1 in the morning, and it was now October 27th, the anniversary of the boy's disappearance. But nothing had happened yet. No screams or visions. Everything was calm. James paced the room and looked out the window. He didn't know why he did it, just a gut feeling. How surprised he was to see a figure dressed in black under his window. In the small village, the residents didn't walk the streets at night, especially near his cursed house. It clearly wasn't a late neighbor. Quickly realizing what was happening, James rushed downstairs and soon burst out onto the porch. The figure in black was walking away from his house, but was still close. "Hey, wait!" James shouted, running after it. The figure stopped and turned. It was an old woman, her wrinkled face resembling a skull covered in yellow skin. Her terrible hooked nose and sunken black eyes completed the horrifying picture. She wore a black scarf on her head, with gray hair peeking out, and a black cloak covered her hunched, thin body. "You," was all James could utter. "Yes, it's me." The old woman's voice sounded like a crow's caw. "You're the reason for all this. You told that man how to resurrect his son, knowing he wouldn't live long, but you did it anyway. Why?" "I didn't know it then," the old woman cawed, but James detected a note of regret in her voice. "Even we don't know everything." "Who is we?" "The souls of the deceased. I am a ghost." Long ago, in the early 19th century, I was a young and beautiful girl. My family was wealthy. We had many servants. And then, I fell in love with the stableman. He was handsome, strong, and smart. I know I sinned. I got pregnant by him, a rich lady from a mere stableman. It was a disgrace to the family. My mother took me to have an underground abortion, but it went wrong, and I died from blood loss. I don't know why they didn't bury me in the family crypt. But here, among the suicides and sinners, maybe because I disgraced my family. For 100 years, I was a restless soul, unable to move on to the afterlife. I mourned my unborn child, my ruined young life. The soul can age even after death. I turned into an old woman and could only wander around like that. Then this man, Roland, came along and placed his son's body right over my remains. I don't know how it happened, but it gave me strength and I was able to appear to him. I knew what needed to be done to resurrect his son from the dead, even at such a cost. I wanted to help him. I had lost a child myself. but it was dark magic. I knew this resurrected child would be marked not by an angelic sign, but by a devilish one. But I didn't tell Roland or the Corstons. They did everything required. I showed you enough. The ritual itself is too terrifying for you to see. But then, as the time for the birth approached, I learned that the Creator would come for his creation anyway. I could only delay it by as long as that boy lived for 5 years. I did it. I saved the Corstons' son, but not for long. James swallowed hard. He was afraid to hear the end of the story, but he knew he had to. The ghostly old woman continued. The closer the end came, the more I worried. I even appeared to the boy several times, though it only scared him. He was already becoming more and more restless and anxious. He cried at night for no reason, drove his parents mad with his tantrums, and didn't obey. The family had endless arguments because of it. One day, the boy cried and fussed all day. He didn't calm down for a minute. He always needed something, wanted something, driving his parents insane. By the end of the day, they were both out of their minds, having a nervous breakdown, and the boy didn't stop crying for a second. And then Mrs. Corston screamed, "Shut up already!" and slapped her son. He fell and hit his temple on the edge of the table. Blood started flowing from his head, and the child lost consciousness. The parents were mad with fear. Not knowing what to do, Meister Corston took his son's body to the nursery and locked the door with a key. "Remember, we have no son, and this room doesn't exist," Mr. Corston said. And his wife just nodded. And that's when their madness began. They themselves believed that their son had disappeared, that he lay there, behind the wall, behind that door, dead. They seemed to have forgotten. They weren't bothered by the horrible, sickly, sweet smell of rotting flesh, or the trickle of blood seeping from under the door. Mrs. Corston just wiped it away as if nothing had happened and went on mourning her grief. The most important thing is that neither the police nor the neighbors saw anything either. They didn't see the door, didn't smell the stench, and firmly believed that the child had gone missing. Only I was a silent witness to all this, but I could do nothing. The devil had taken his due, and the rest you already know. The old woman fell silent. James didn't remain silent. "So behind that door are the remains of the boy?" he asked in horror. "Yes, that's right. They lie there to this day, and because of that, all these terrible things happen in the house. Why do I and my aunt see this door when others don't? You are the rightful owners of the house and everything associated with it, so you see it. All right, then the main question. How do I unlock this door and bury the poor boy to make it all stop? I'm afraid it's not that simple. This house shouldn't be here at all. It's a cursed place. Not only my spirit haunts these surroundings, there will never be peace for the living here. The only chance to fix anything is to demolish the house, level it with the ground, and after retrieving the bones from the rubble, bury them. I don't know of any other way. That won't be easy, demolishing the house. You'd better hurry, the old woman continued as if she hadn't heard him. I sense that something bad will happen on the 70th anniversary, and it's already here. Hurry! Having said this, the old woman disappeared, dissolving into the night, leaving James alone and utterly confused. How am I supposed to destroy the house? James thought, scratching his head. But he didn't dare disobey the old ghost. He glanced back at his house, which stood on the outskirts of the village, a bit apart from the others. Sighing heavily, he returned to his cursed dwelling, deciding not to go upstairs. It was too frightening now. He spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch on the first floor, sleepless, thinking about how to destroy the house. Finally, he decided that everything had started with fire, and it should end with fire. At dawn, he went to his car, retrieved a gasoline canister, and went back inside. He went upstairs, now filled with dread, and started pouring gasoline everywhere, especially generously on the cursed door. "Be damned," he muttered angrily. Then the screams started again. "Mommy! Mommy, don't! Save me! Mommy, I'm so scared here. Help me! Get me out of here!" I'll save you. Just let me finish this." James chuckled, no longer scared by the cries from behind the door. Ignoring the screams, he started to go downstairs, leaving a trail of gasoline behind him. As he reached the first floor, he turned around, scanning the living room, and saw another figure in black. "Old woman, is that you?" James asked. But the figure didn't respond. It just hovered above the floor. "I don't have time to play games with you. You told me to destroy the house, and I'm destroying it. I'll burn it down." "You won't do that," came a voice from under the black hood of the figure. This was not the creaky voice of the old woman. It was a soul-wrenching voice that seemed to come from the depths of hell. James's hair stood on end from the sound of it. Who are you?" he stammered. "I am the one who won't allow the curse to be broken. Today it will gain true power, and soon it will consume everything around it." With these words, the figure waved its hand, and Brown was thrown aside like a feather, hitting the wall painfully. As he fell, his canister tipped over, spilling gasoline, but the figure didn't notice. It turned towards James, and he saw two red eyes under the hood, burning with a devilish fire. It was a gaze that pinned him to the floor, unable to move from fear as the figure approached him. He broke into a cold sweat, terrified of what was going to happen to him. "I can't let this creature take over everything," James thought. "Maybe I'll die, but I won't let the curse spread." With an immense effort of will, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a gasoline lighter. The gasoline from the canister had already formed a large puddle and was almost reaching James. The figure was close now, reeking of decay and death. "No, damn you! I won't let you win so easily!" James shouted, striking the lighter and throwing it into the gasoline puddle. Flame shot up to the ceiling. "No!" The scream from the figure in black nearly burst James's eardrums. The ghost darted towards the fire but recoiled, unable to change anything. The fire quickly spread through the room, climbed the gasoline trail on the stairs, and raged on the second floor. James got to his feet, swaying slightly from the impact and the smell of smoke, struggling to breathe. He tried to make his way to the exit, but the figure blocked his path again. "You won't leave here so easily, human. You are destroying the house, but it will become your grave." "We'll see about that," James said, trying to rush past the ghost, but he was thrown against the wall again, hitting it even harder. At that moment, one of the ceiling beams fell, blocking the exit. "Die, human!" With these words, the figure disappeared into thin air. Everything blurred before James's eyes. He was suffocating from the acrid smoke, his eyes burning from the fumes, and his skin was already being scorched by the heat. There was no chance of getting out now. The door was engulfed in flames. Debris was everywhere. It was a miracle he hadn't been crushed yet. With his last bit of strength, James got to his feet and saw a window. It was still possible to get to it. Wrapping his head and hands with his jacket, he ran through the burning corridor and jumped at the window. He grabbed the handle at first, but quickly let go with a cry as the metal burned his hand. Wrapping his head again, he charged at the window, smashing it, and fell onto the lawn outside the house. Choking on smoke, he crawled away. Reaching his car, James hid behind it and passed out. James woke up in someone's house. He was lying on a couch in the living room. He tried to sit up quickly, but his head spun, and he lay back down with a groan. "Oh, James, you're awake!" His elderly neighbor Matt leaned over him, with a kind-looking old woman beside him, presumably his wife. "You found me and brought me here. Thank you." "Yes, you were lying near your car," Matt's wife said. "And your house burned down completely. What happened?" James hesitated. He couldn't tell them about the curse, the black figure, and the dead boy. An accident, old house, old wiring? Something shorted out and caught fire. I couldn't get out right away, inhaled a lot of smoke and barely crawled out. I didn't like that house anyway. I won't even report it, I'll just leave. Matt and his wife didn't argue with James. They let him rest, then gave him a bath and a hearty breakfast. James was immensely grateful to them. He couldn't remember the last time he ate or washed properly. Leaving Matt's house, James went to his burned-down property, still needing to do one thing. Among the charred boards and other debris, he searched for the boy's bones but couldn't find them. Despite his efforts, he couldn't locate the remains. They must have turned to ash, he thought. There was nothing more he could do, but the house was destroyed and the curse was lifted. "Rest in peace, little one," James said, turning away from the cursed ruins. His car started quickly and he drove away without looking back. Finally, this chapter was behind him. A year later, James was sitting in his cozy little apartment in San Francisco, drinking coffee and reading the morning paper when, to his shock, the cup slipped from his hands and shattered. What he saw in the paper horrified him. There was a small article about a piece of land in a small village that had finally been sold, where a house had burned down a year ago. No one wanted to live on that land because it was considered cursed. The landowner, who wished to remain anonymous, had turned it over to the administration. This year, they managed to sell the land to a young family from Los Angeles. But what scared James the most wasn't the article itself, but the photo beneath it. It showed the family who had bought the land. A young woman, a man, and a little girl about 3 or 4 years old. And behind them was a shadow, a figure in black, hovering above the ground, waiting for its next victim.